They thought a 90-year-old widow in Red Valley would be easy prey. An old house, sagging fences, and no one to defend her. The gang mocked, stole, and circled her land, certain she'd break. But what they didn't know was that her son, Major Daniel Briggs, a soldier forged overseas, was on his way home. When he stepped off that bus in plain clothes, the balance shifted. One man, one promise, and one mother who refused to yield. What happens when outlaws discover the house they chose is the wrong one? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The land stretched flat beneath the Red Valley sky, a wide plain of dry grass and weathered fences, where the wind carried the sound of creaking boards and the lonely cry of a hawk circling above. At the far end of a dirt road that rarely saw strangers stood the Briggs Ranch, a place once alive with the weight of cattle, wagons, and long days of harvest. Now it was quiet. The barns leaned with age, their paint long stripped by sun and dust, and the fields bore more weeds and feed. It was here that Eleanor Briggs lived, 90 years behind her and stubborn enough to face each day alone. Her mornings began the same way they had for decades. A kettle on the stove, its whistle filling a kitchen lined with shelves her late husband had built by hand. She would sit at the old oak table, the one scarred by knife marks and coffee rings, with a cup of weak tea and her Bible folded open beside her. Her glasses slipped low on her nose, and she pushed them up with a wrinkled hand whenever the small print blurred. Around her, the silence was total, except for the groan of what's settling in the rafters. Eleanor's body had grown frail, but her spirit clung to routines that kept her anchored. She tied her silver hair back into a bun each morning, smoothed the same worn dress, and laced boots that had carried her across the ranch for nearly 20 years. She carried a cane now, though she hated the sound it made against the porch boards. Each step across her land was measured, not for lack of will, but because she knew the ground too well. Every post, every gate, every rusting hinge spoke of work done and work undone, of family gone and promises kept. Her neighbors rarely visited. A few had stopped by after her husband passed, bringing casseroles and awkward condolences, but time thinned those gestures until the ranch stood forgotten. The town of Red Valley kept its distance, busy with newer farms and younger families who spoke of Eleanor in the past tense, as though she were already gone. Only the postman's occasional truck broke the stillness, leaving letters and bills in a tin box by the road. Most days, she did not bother to fetch them until evening. It was during those walks to the mailbox that she began to notice small things out of place. A fence post knocked over that had stood firm the day before. Boot prints pressed too deep in the dirt, leading toward the barn. Once, she found the latch on her chicken coop unfastened, though she had sworn she closed it herself. The hens clucked nervously that morning. Feathers scattered across the yard, but none were missing. She told herself it was her memory, slipping like the hinges of the gate, but deep down she knew better. She moved slower these days, but her eyes had not dimmed. From a front porch she could see the road that cut through the valley, and on certain evenings she caught sight of figures at a distance. Men on horseback, or sometimes motorcycles, their engines echoing off the hills. They did not pass by quickly like travelers bound elsewhere. They lingered. She watched them pause, pointing toward her ranch, laughing in low voices carried by the wind. When she shifted in her chair, reaching for her cane, they would ride on, leaving dust clouds that hung in the air long after. Inside the house, on the mantel above the cold fireplace, sat a row of envelopes tied with string. They bore her son's careful handwriting, the return address marked only by military bases in faraway places. She had not opened them, though she dusted them each week. It was not that she did not care, but that his words felt too heavy, too full of danger she could not control. To keep them sealed was to keep him safe in her mind, somewhere just beyond reach but still alive. The valley had grown harsher in recent years. Jobs disappeared, leaving behind men with too much time and too little purpose. Eleanor knew the type had seen their fathers and uncles in younger days, always searching for someone weaker to lean on, for land to claim that was not theirs. She felt their eyes on her ranch now, on her age, on the knowledge that no one came to visit. The Briggs land was old, but it was hers, and though her body bent with years, she would not let go of it without a fight. At dusk, She sat on the porch with her shawl wrapped tight, listening to the coyotes cry in the distance. The sound mingled with the memory of hooves from long ago, when her husband and son had driven cattle across the valley, filling the air with dust and laughter. Those days were gone, but the land still held them in silence, waiting. Eleanor sipped her tea, steadying her hand against the tremor in her fingers. The horizon glowed faintly red as the sun set, and she knew in her bones that quiet would not last. Someone was watching, and sooner or later they would come closer. The morning began like any other, with Eleanor stepping out onto the porch as the valley stretched beneath a pale sky. The air was cool enough to carry the smell of sage from the hills, and her breath lingered faintly in the crisp dawn. She leaned on her cane, scanning the fences that marked the edge of her property. In her youth, she would have walked the line herself, tightening wire, replacing posts, keeping what was hers in order. Now, the distance seemed larger than it once had been, though her eyes still caught every shift in the land. That was why the details stood out immediately. At the far corner of the west pasture, one of the fence posts looked wrong. She squinted, hands shading her face, and noticed not only that the post was tilted, but that the wood glinted in an odd way under the rising sun. She pushed forward slowly, her boots crunching against gravel and dry weeds, each step deliberate. The cane sank lightly into the earth with every pace, keeping her upright against the uneven ground. By the time she reached the post, she already knew what she would find. The surface had been gouged by a knife, the cuts sharp and deliberate. A crude shape stared back at her, something between a skull and a brand. The edges were fresh, the wood still pale beneath the carved lines. Around it, boot prints trampled the dirt, the kind left by heavy soles, not the worn shoes of farmhands, but the thicker tread of men who spent more time riding than working. Eleanor stood silently, her thin fingers brushing the grooves in the wood. It was not vandalism for the sake of mischief. It was a message. Later that day, she heard the sound that confirmed her suspicion. The low rumble came first, faint at the edge of hearing, until it grew into the uneven thunder of motorcycles mixed with the sharp rhythm of hooves. The outlaws came down the road in a loose line, some riding horses, others astride battered machines that coughed smoke and roared against the valley silence. Dust rose behind them like a storm. Eleanor sat stiffly on her porch, her back straight, hands folded over the cane resting across her lap. She had no intention of retreating indoors. The riders slowed as they passed her gate, laughter carrying on the wind. She could hear snatches of their voices, mocking tones made clear even when the words broke apart in the distance. They called out Grandma and Old Bones, cackling as they tipped their heads toward her. One raised a hand in a mock salute. Another spat in the dust. Their presence was not hurried. They wanted her to see them, wanted her to feel how easily they could pass by and mark her place as theirs to watch. She did not flinch, though her heart beat hard enough to press against her ribs. She kept her eyes steady on them, the same way she once stared down coyotes that lingered too near the flock. The gang did not stop, but their pace slowed at every fence line, as if measuring the land. When they reached the far end, the horses turned and galloped into the open field, cutting across her property without care. The motorcycles followed along the edge, tires spitting gravel into the weeds. Their laughter rose again before they vanished over the rise. When the dust settled, Eleanor walked the boundary once more. Another fence post bore fresh marks, this time deeper, the same crude emblem carved into the wood. She pressed her hand against it, feeling how deliberate the gouges were, as though the knife had lingered to make its meaning impossible to mistake. The wind carried silence again, but felt different than before. It was no longer the quiet of a forgotten ranch. It was a quiet after an intrusion, the kind that reminded her she was being watched. Inside the house, she sat by the kitchen window, her gaze never leaving the road. The letters from her son still lay tied on the mantel, untouched. She thought of him then, of the way he had walked across this same porch years ago with a duffel over his shoulder and determination in his eyes. She wondered what he would say now, what words he would give to calm her heart. She whispered his name under her breath, not as a prayer but as a reminder that she was not entirely alone. As the sun dipped lower, the carved post stood out against the fading light, white scars on dark wood. Eleanor closed the curtains, though she left the lamp unlit. The house sank into shadow, her hand tight on the cane across her lap. She had lived long enough to know the difference between mischief and threat. This was no accident, no boys testing courage. It was the beginning of something that would not stop on its own. The valley seemed to hold its breath with her, waiting for the next step the Outlaws would take. The following morning, Eleanor rode the rickety bus into town, as she did once every 2 weeks for supplies. The trip was a necessity, though the effort left her weary. Her cane tapped the metal steps as she climbed down, clutching her purse against her side, and she walked a short distance from the stop to the general store. Red Valley was little more than a main street framed by low buildings, some painted bright years ago, but now fading beneath the harsh sun. A diner, a feed store, the sheriff's office, and a few shops made up the heart of the town. Life there moved slowly. Yet even in such quiet places, news traveled faster than truth. She pushed the door open, the bell above jingling as the scent of sawdust and grain dust filled her nose. A couple of men stood at the counter speaking in low tones. Their voices trailed off when she entered, though they greeted her politely enough. Eleanor's steps were steady as she moved down the aisle, lifting flour, sugar, and coffee into her basket. The weight was enough to strain her arms, but she refused offers of help, as she always did. Still, she noticed the way their eyes followed her, curiosity behind politeness, as though she carried some story that had not yet reached its ending. At the counter, while the clerk bagged her goods, she asked whether anyone else had seen riders out her way. His hand slowed just enough for her to notice. "Might have been some drifters," he said, avoiding her gaze. "Boys from across the county sometimes take the long road. Nothing to worry about. They carved into my fence," Eleanor said, her voice calm but firm. "That's no boy's mischief." The clerk gave a small shrug, glancing toward the men near the door. One of them cleared his throat, muttered something about kids showing off, and looked away. The other picked at a nail with his pocket knife. Neither man offered more. Eleanor understood then that the story had already made its rounds. People knew, but they had chosen not to see. She carried her bag out onto the boardwalk, stopping for a moment to rest. Across the street at the diner, men in work shirts sat at the counter drinking coffee, their voices low. She caught fragments of conversation carried on the breeze, mention of outlaws, of tracks by her land, of trouble best left alone. When her eyes met theirs through the window, they bent their heads to their mugs. The sheriff stepped out of his office just then, tugging his hat low over his brow. He was younger than her son, lean with the weariness of someone who knew his authority did not extend as far as it should. Eleanor raised her hand to catch his attention. He paused, gave a small nod, but when she asked again about riders on her land, his answer was the same practice line. "I'll keep an eye out. Likely nothing to it." "You know it's not nothing," she replied, her eyes narrowing. His shoulders shifted uncomfortably, boots scraping the dirt street. "There's only so much one man can do, Mrs. Briggs. Best not to stir it up more than it is." She recognized fear in his voice. It wasn't laziness. It was a calculation of a man who knew that facing certain people meant trouble that spread wider than one ranch. She held his gaze until he dropped his eyes and tipped his hat before walking away. Back on the bus with her groceries beside her, Eleanor sat in silence as the landscape rolled past. The other passengers avoided her eyes, though she felt their glances when they thought she wasn't looking. Everyone knew, yet no one would name it aloud. That was how small towns survived, by closing ranks not around a victim, but around the silence that kept them safe. When the bus let her off at the dirt road, the valley air felt heavier than it had before. She paused to catch her breath, looking across the pasture toward her scarred fence posts. They glared back at her, crude emblems cut deep into the wood, reminders that others claimed power here. She tightened her grip on her cane, whispering into the wind as if her son might somehow hear her across the distance. The town had turned its face away, but the valley did not lie. The threat was real, and it was waiting. The evening light bled slowly through the lace curtains, softening the edges of the living room until every corner seemed suspended in dust and memory. Eleanor moved carefully from the kitchen, one hand gripping her cane, the other steadying herself along the wall. The day's groceries had been put away, the kettle scrubbed and dried, the the silence restored to the house. She lowered herself into the armchair by the cold fireplace, where shadows deepened as the sun dipped behind the ridge. Across from her, above the mantel carved from oak her husband had once polished smooth, lay the small stack of envelopes bound with twine. They had arrived one by one, their paper yellowing around the edges, the postmarks smudged with places she had never seen. Some bore stamps from military bases in the desert, others from cities with names she could not pronounce. Each one carried her son's handwriting, neat and deliberate, the strokes as disciplined as the life he lived. She had never opened them. It was not because she did not care. It was because the words inside might carry truths too heavy to bear alone in this quiet house. As long as they stayed sealed, Daniel remained unheard in her mind, always away, always writing, always promising to return. Sometimes, late at night, she would untie the string and hold one of the envelopes to her chest, feeling the weight of it like a heartbeat pressed against her palm. The ink on the front, faded but still sharp, brought back the image of him at 18, broad-shouldered already, standing tall in his uniform before leaving for basic training. He had written to her then, too, short lines about camp food and long marches, though even in those early letters she had heard the restraint between his words. Daniel had always been careful with her, sparing her details she might not want to know. The mantle itself had become an altar of sorts. Beside the letters sat a photograph in a brass frame, its glass smudged by the touch of her fingers over the years. It showed Daniel with his arm around his father, taken before deployment. Both men wore the same steady expression, the look of people who had seen enough of the world to know its sharp edges. Her husband's eyes had grown softer with age, but Daniel's carried the same firmness they had when he was a boy fixing fence posts with his bare hands. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, studying the pile of letters. Her mind wandered to the question sealed inside. Had he been cold? Had he been wounded? Did he write to her on nights when he could not sleep, or in tents filled with the sound of distant fire? She imagined him hunched over a small table, pen gripped tight, pausing between sentences to listen for danger. The thought of it made her chest ache, but she had chosen not to know. To know would mean living with the fear of every detail. To leave them closed meant holding on to the illusion of safety. The house groaned in the wind, a shutter banging faintly against the siding. She reached for her shawl, draping across her shoulders, and listened to the silence. It was a silence that weighed most heavily. The absence of boots on the porch, of a son's voice filling the kitchen, of laughter that had once rolled across the fields. That absence filled every room, pressing down on her as firmly as any hand. It was not just Daniel who was gone. It was the life she had built around him, the rhythm of days shaped by his presence. Her eyes drifted to the old clock above the doorway. Its ticking had slowed with age, though it still marked the hours faithfully. She wondered if, in some foreign desert, Daniel carried a watch, measuring time in the same steady way. Did he think of her at night, picturing the ranch as it had been, or did he push the thought aside to keep himself steady? The questions lingered like smoke. She rose slowly, using the cane to steady herself, and approached the mantel. Her fingers brushed the string that bound the letters, feeling the rough texture against her skin. She considered, for the first time in years, breaking the seal. She could almost hear his voice inside, steady and calm, telling her what he could not say aloud when he left. But her hand fell back to her side. The weight of the unknown felt safer than the certainty of whatever waited in those pages. As she lowered herself back into the chair, her eyes stayed fixed on the letters. They had become a presence of their own, filling the silence with what might be, with what might never be. Outside, the valley darkened, coyotes calling in the distance. Inside, the house seemed to breathe around her, the air thick with memory and waiting. Eleanor closed her eyes, whispering her son's name into the stillness, as though it might carry across the miles to wherever he stood. The unopened letters remained on the mantel, silent witnesses to the years between them, their weight heavier than any weapon, their absence louder than the outlaws who circled her land. The morning began with the sound of silence where sound should have been. Eleanor rose stiffly from her bed, pulled her shawl tight against the chill, and stepped out onto the porch. Normally, the cattle could be heard lowing in the distance, a rough music that had been part of her days for longer than she cared to remember. That morning, the valley lay still. She stood for a moment, cane pressed against the floorboards, waiting for the sound to carry. None came. She walked slowly toward the pasture, each step steady but labored. The dirt path was familiar, worn by years of boots and hooves, but now it seemed too wide, too empty. When she reached the first gate, her breath caught in her chest. The iron latch hung loose, swinging slightly in the wind. The chain that had secured it lay broken in the dust, its links twisted in a way no accident could have caused. She bent, fingers trembling, to lift it, and the truth pressed down on her. Someone had been here in the night. She pushed through the gate, leaning harder on her cane as she crossed the uneven ground. The pasture stretched wide, grass patchy and dry from the season, but where she expected to see her herd, she found emptiness. The earth bore tracks, hoof prints scattered wildly, as though the cattle had been driven hard in one direction. Deeper in the dirt lay the sharper impressions of boots, circling the herd, steering it like wolves around sheep. She followed them slowly, her eyes scanning the horizon, but the valley gave nothing back. Eleanor paused at the fence line on the far side of the field. The wire had been cut clean, the post pulled apart just enough to allow passage. The precision of it angered her more than the loss itself. This was not the work of coyotes or stray hunters. This was deliberate, practiced, carried out by men who knew how to move animals without leaving too much behind. She steadied herself, gripping the wood until her knuckles whitened. The gang that had circled her land, laughing at her age, had come back in the dark to take more than her piece. The thought carried her back to her husband's time, when rustlers had been the curse of every rancher. Back then, neighbors rode together, rifles across their saddles, to chase thieves from the valley. Now, there was no one to ride with her. The town had already turned its eyes away, muttering about drifters, pretending not to see. The sheriff had offered words but not action. She was alone here, standing on land that seemed to shrink under her feet. She turned back toward the house, her legs trembling with each step. The loss cut deeper than money. Those cattle had been among the last living remnants of the life she and her husband had built together. He had raised them from calves, passed down knowledge of their care, and Daniel had learned to decide. Each animal carried memory as much as value. Now the pasture lay stripped, and the silence that followed her home was louder than any laughter from the outlaws who had taken them. Inside, she lowered herself into a chair by the kitchen window, staring out at the empty fields. Her hands worked restlessly, twisting the hem of her shawl. On the mantel, the letters sat where they always had, untouched. She glanced at them, the weight of her son's absence pressing heavier than before. If he had been there, this would not have happened. The gates would not have been left hanging. The herd would not have been driven off. She whispered his name, not as a cry for help, but as if speaking it might hold the walls of the house together. The days stretched on without the rhythm of animals to tend, the chores hollowed out by loss. Each creak of the boards, each gust of wind through the eaves seemed echo the same truth. They were not finished. Taking the herd was not the end. It was only another warning carved into the shape of her days, as deliberate as the knife marks on her fence. They meant to press her further, to bend her will until she let go of the land. As evening fell, Eleanor lit the lamp and sat again in silence. Her eyes traced the dark horizon, waiting for dust clouds or the glint of steel under moonlight. The valley, once a shield, had become an open stage where she was meant to stand alone. But in the stillness, her jaw tightened. The land had been hers too long to be given away like spoils. The cattle were gone, the gates broken, but the house still stood, and so did she. By late afternoon, the dust of the road rose in a long, slow ribbon, signaling the approach of a vehicle. Eleanor watched from her porch chair, one hand resting on her cane, the other holding a chipped mug of tea gone cold. The shape of the county cruiser grew clear as it wound along the path, its paint dulled by years of service, its tires spitting gravel when it finally pulled up in front of the house. The sheriff stepped out, adjusting his belt and glancing toward the horizon as though reluctant to fix his eyes on her for too long. He was a tall man, younger than her son would be, though already graying at the edges. His boots crunched against the earth as he walked up, hat tilted low, a folder tucked beneath his arm. "Afternoon, Mrs. Briggs," he said, voice careful, as if the simple greeting might set something fragile in motion. "Afternoon, Sheriff," she replied, her gaze steady. "You've heard, then?" He nodded, not quite meeting her eyes. "Word gets around quick. Some cattle gone missing. Fences cut. I came to take a statement." She gestured toward the pasture, empty and silent behind her. "You don't need a statement to see what's happened. They took the herd, and they wanted me to know it was them. This wasn't coyotes or boys fooling around." The sheriff opened the folder, flipped through a few blank forms, then closed it again as though filling them out were unnecessary. "I don't doubt you, ma'am, but proving it, that's another matter. These days, gangs ride through from one county to the next. Hard to pin things on anyone in particular." Eleanor's voice sharpened. "You've seen the marks they left on my posts. You know who rides through here. You're just hoping it'll blow past without trouble." The sheriff sighed, his shoulders sagging beneath the weight of unspoken truths. He leaned against a railing, his boots leaving dust on the boards her husband had once kept polished. "Look, I've got 3 deputies covering half this county. We don't have the men or the budget to be tangling with fellas who don't scare easy. These boys, they got numbers. They got friends in places that matter. Making noise at them only brings more down on us." Eleanor straightened in her chair, her small frame stiffening with a dignity that had never left her. "And what about me? Am I supposed to sit here and let them carve their threats into my land until there's nothing left? My husband worked these fields. My son bled for this country. And you stand here telling me there's nothing you can do." He shifted uneasily, looking out toward the hills rather than into her eyes. "What I'm saying is, it's not worth the risk, Mrs. Briggs. Sometimes the best course is to let things settle, not stir them up. Maybe they'll take what they want and move on." The words hung between them like ash. Eleanor's hand tightened on her cane, her knuckles white against the polished wood. "That's your protection? Hoping they grow tired of tormenting an old woman." The sheriff swallowed hard, his throat working against words he couldn't quite bring himself to speak. Finally, he set the folder down on the porch rail, unopened. "I'll file a report," he muttered. "Officially, but off the record. If you've got family, maybe now's the time to think about staying with them a while. This land," he hesitated, catching himself before finishing the thought, but the meaning was clear. This land wasn't worth the fight in his eyes. Eleanor's gaze hardened. "My family has bled enough for land other people didn't think worth defending. This ranch is mine, and I'll not be chased from it by boys who carve their names into wood to feel big." The sheriff adjusted his hat, clearing his throat, unable to hold her stare. "I'll swing by when I can," he said finally, though the words carried no weight. He turned back toward his cruiser, folder still under his arm, and drove away without another glance. Eleanor sat in the deepening quiet, the rumble of the engine fading down the road. She knew what his visit had meant. Not protection, not justice, but warning. The law would not stand between her and the men who prowled her land. If anything was to hold them back, it would not come from the county office. She reached for the letters on the mantel through the window, their edges glowing faintly in the evening light. Her son's absence was a wound the sheriff's excuses could not soothe. The valley belonged to those willing to fight for it, and tonight she understood she was being left to fight alone. The night after the sheriff's visit pressed in heavier than most. Eleanor moved slowly through the house, lighting only a single lamp in the kitchen. Its glow spread weakly across the wooden table, casting long shadows that reached toward the walls. The silence felt brittle, as though the house itself understood that the line between safety and danger had thinned to nothing. She lowered herself into her husband's chair and let her hand rest on the scarred wood. For years she had avoided touching the rifle he had left behind, stored in the cabinet above the hearth where dust had settled over it like a shroud. Tonight she rose and fetched it. The cabinet door creaked open, resisting at first, then giving way. Inside lay the Winchester, its once polished barrel dulled by time, the stock worn smooth by hands that carried it through countless dawns and long rides. Eleanor lifted it out with care, surprised by its weight. Her fingers trembled, not from fear alone, but from age, from the weakness that years had planted in her bones. Still, she carried it to the table and set it down gently, as one might place a relic. For a long moment, she simply looked at it, breathing evenly, remembering her husband's steady arms, the way he had shouldered the weapon during lean years when coyotes pressed close to the herd. She gathered the cleaning kit from a box beneath the counter, setting each piece in order, oil, cloth, brushes worn at the edges. The motions came back slowly, fragments of memory guiding her hands. She remembered sitting across from him at this very table, watching as he disassembled a rifle, explaining each part though she never thought she would need to know. Now those lessons rose from the dust of memory, carrying her through the first hesitant movements. The screws loosened under her grip, the metal parts separating with a faint scrape. Her hand shook, but she pressed forward, determination filling the gaps where strength faltered. The barrel was clogged with years of neglect, patches of rust blooming along its length. She ran the brush through, twisting carefully, listening to the rasp of bristles against steel. The smell of oil spread into the room, sharp and familiar, mixing with the scent of dust and old wood. She paused often, resting her hand against the table to still the tremor in her fingers. Yet with each pass of the cloth, the rifle began to change. The dullness gave way to a quiet gleam, the parts fitting back into place as though recognizing her touch. Eleanor's mind drifted as she worked. She saw her husband again, shoulders broad, head bowed slightly as he cleaned the same weapon. She heard his voice telling her that a rifle was less about the shot and more about the will behind it. A man who aimed with conviction, he said, carried more strength than 10 who pulled the trigger without it. She whispered those words aloud now, letting them steady her. The tremor in her hands did not vanish, but it no longer stopped her. When the rifle was whole again, she laid it across her lap. The weight felt both foreign and familiar, as if she were holding a piece of her past and her future in the same moment. She ran her hand along the stock, the wood warm under her palm, and lifted it carefully, sighting down the barrel at the far wall. Her vision blurred slightly, but the act itself filled her with a calm resolve. The house was no longer defenseless. Outside, the valley lay in darkness, the wind carrying faint sounds of movement from somewhere beyond the hills. She knew they might return, perhaps tonight, perhaps later, certain that she was too old to stand in their way. Eleanor leaned the rifle against the table within reach, then folded her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The fear was still there, sharp and real, but it no longer ruled her. She had chosen to meet it with steel in her hands, the same way her husband once had. She extinguished the lamp and let the house sink into shadow, the rifle resting close at her side. Sleep would come lightly, if at all, but her heart was steadier than it had been in days. Tomorrow might bring more threats carved into wood, more silent from the town, but tonight she had drawn her own line. The widow of Red Valley would not be moved by laughter or fear. She held her ground, and the old rifle gleamed faintly in the dark as proof. The night lay heavy over Red Valley, the kind of darkness that seemed to press down from the hills and swallow every sound. Eleanor sat her chair near the kitchen window, the rifle leaning against the table beside her, her shawl wrapped tightly around her thin shoulders. Sleep had been slow to come since the cattle were taken, and now it hovered just out of reach, her ears straining against the silence. Each creak of the old house, each sigh of the wind to the rafters, kept her sharp-eyed and restless. When the first rock struck, it was not a subtle sound. The crash of glass shattered the stillness, sprang across the floor in a violent burst. Eleanor flinched, her heart thudding hard against her ribs, but her hand found the rifle stock without hesitation. She pushed herself upright, cane in one hand, weapon in the other, and turned toward the front room. Another rock followed, exploding to the side window, sending shards scattering across the rug. The cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the sound of laughter. She did not rush to the porch. Instead, she stood inside, hidden by the shadows, listening. More stones hit the walls, thudding against the old wood, but no further windows broke. The voices outside were cruel in their amusement, young men emboldened by darkness. "Come on out, Grandma," one shouted, his words slurred, perhaps by drink. Another voice rose in a mocking whistle, followed by the sound of spitting into the dirt. Eleanor's grip on the rifle tightened, though she held her breath, waiting. After a few moments, the laughter shifted direction, moving toward the barn. She eased herself across the room, careful not to step on glass. Through the broken window, she caught only glimpses. Figures moving quick, the glow of a lantern swaying back and forth. Then came the smell of paint, sharp and pungent, cutting through the night air. They were marking her property as theirs. Her husband had built that barn with his own hands. Timber by timber, Daniel had helped him oil the hinges, had carried hay bales in his youth until his back grew strong. The barn had held their livelihood, their history. Now, as the minutes passed, she could almost hear the spray of paint hissing against the wood, deliberate strokes defacing what had stood for decades. When the laughter rose again, it carried pride in their work, as if the destruction itself were victory. Eleanor's body trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of fury she rarely allowed herself to feel. She lifted the rifle to the window, sighting down its barrel. Though her finger did not touch the trigger, she could see shadows shifting against the barn doors, the outline of the symbol forming jagged, crude lines meant to instill fear. Her husband had always said a rifle was most powerful not when fired, but when it reminded men that someone was ready to defend what was theirs. She kept the barrel steady, her presence invisible, a silent counter to their noise. After a while, the gang tired of their spectacle. The sound of boots scuffed against the dirt, a motorcycle roared to life, and horses shuffled impatiently. With a final round of mocking laughter, they retreated into the night, leaving behind the scars of their visit. The valley grew quiet again, but the silence was no comfort. It carried the echo of broken glass, the smell of paint still hanging sharp in the air. When Eleanor finally stepped outside, the moonlight fell across the barn doors, revealing the mark clearly. A skull-like shape, jagged and uneven, sprawled across the wood in dripping black. The sight of it cut deeper than the cold wind against her face. It was not just vandalism. It was a claim, a message carved in symbols as clear as words. This land was no longer hers alone. She stood before it for a long while, cane planted firmly in the dirt, rifle across her arm. The barn loomed behind the symbol, weathered but enduring, much like herself. Her hands shook as she traced the air in front of the painted lines, refusing to touch them, refusing to give them more power than they already held. Then she turned back to the house, glass crunching beneath her boots as she stepped inside. She did not sweep the shards away that night. She left them where they fell, a reminder that the threat was not imagined but real, pressing closer with each visit. Sitting once more in her chair, the rifle propped against her knees, she whispered into the silence, not in fear but in quiet defiance. The valley might echo with their laughter, the barn might bear their mark, but she was not yet broken. The house still stood, and so did she. The news of the midnight attack traveled faster than Eleanor expected. By the time she came into town for flour and kerosene, the whispers had already gathered in corners, tucked themselves behind half-closed doors, and threaded through the booths at the diner. Her broken windows had not been cleaned yet. The painted barn still bore the dripping emblem, but she felt the weight of eyes on her as if the town itself had taken on the task of telling her what she already knew. Her home was no longer hers alone. That evening, the church hall was open for a meeting. The space was plain, its wooden floor polished by decades of footsteps, the air tinged with the faint smell of coffee from urns set at the back. Locals filed in slowly, hats in hand, coats shrugged off, their voices low but insistent. Eleanor entered late, leaning on her cane, her shawl pulled tight against her shoulders. A few nodded in her direction, but most looked past her, unwilling to hold her gaze for long. She found a chair near the side wall, settling into it with quiet dignity, listening. The sheriff was present, his hat resting on the table before him, his face lined with fatigue. He spoke first, his voice carrying over the small crowd. "We all know there's been some trouble out at the Briggs place," he began, careful, as though the words themselves might draw danger closer. "Cattle missing, fences cut, windows broken. I want to assure you we're looking into it." A murmur ran through the hall, not of confidence but of unease. One of the men from the feed store cleared his throat. "Sheriff, with respect, looking into it won't keep them from coming back. Everyone knows who's behind it. You think they'll stop at paint on a barn? Next time it'll be fire." A woman at the far end spoke softly, her hands folded in her lap. "She's 90 years old. She can't stand against men like that. Maybe it's time someone told her. Maybe it's time she considered selling. The words hung in the air, sharp though spoken gently. Heads turned toward Eleanor, some with pity, others with calculation. Another man added, "Land like that, out on the edge, no neighbors close by, brings the wrong kind of attention. If she let it go, maybe for a fair price, it'd put an end to this business." "Fair price?" Someone scoffed near the back. "Everyone knows those boys don't pay fair. They take what they want. Best she sells cheap and leaves while she still can." The voices grew louder, circling the same point from different angles, until the room seemed filled with the hum of resignation. No one suggested riding out together. No one spoke of standing guard or mending fences. Instead, the talk bent always toward retreat, toward giving up ground before something worse arrived. The meeting was less about protecting Eleanor than protecting themselves from being drawn into her fight. Eleanor sat still, her face expressionless, though inside the words cut deep. She had known the town would not risk much for her, but hearing it aloud stripped away even the pretense of solidarity. To them, her age and solitude marked her as expendable, a problem best solved by disappearance. Selling cheap was a polite way of saying she should vanish quietly before trouble spread beyond her ranch. When the sheriff finally called the meeting to order again, his words did little to shift the current. "We'll do what we can," he said, though the hollowness in his tone betrayed him. "But everyone should use caution. Times are changing. We've got to be practical." The gathering broke apart slowly, chairs scraping against the floor, boots thudding toward the door. People approached Eleanor with half-hearted gestures, an offer a ride home, a muttered "stay safe." But none stayed long enough to look her fully in the eye. She declined each politely, rose with effort, and walked out into the cool night air alone. The road back to her ranch stretched dark beneath the stars, the valley wide and quiet. She moved carefully up her porch steps, pausing before the broken window. The shards had been swept into a neat pile early that day, but the frame remained empty, a wound in the side of the house. She looked toward the barn, the painted symbol stark even in the moonlight. The town had spoken. They believed surrender was her only defense. Eleanor set her cane against the doorframe and stood straighter than her body allowed. Selling men erasing her husband's sweat, her son's boyhood, the very bones of her life buried in that soil. The voices in the hall had not understood that. To them, land was money, and money was safety. To her, land was memory, and memory was not for sale. She picked up her cane again and stepped inside. Alone, yes, but resolved. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that did not simply mean absence of sound, but the weight of memory pressing into every corner. Eleanor moved slowly through the narrow hallway, her cane tapping against the worn boards that had carried decades of footsteps. The air smelled faintly of cedar and dust, familiar and unchanged, though it had been years since another soul lived beneath the roof. Her hand brushed the wallpaper as she walked, its faded pattern still visible where the sun had not touched. Each room she passed held some trace of what had been, and tonight, when sleep refused her, she let herself follow those echoes. In the parlor, the rocking chair remained near the window, its cushions sagging from years of use. She remembered Daniel there as a boy, his legs too short to reach the floor, rocking with impatient energy while his father laced up boots for the day's work. His questions had been endless, his eyes always drawn to the tools his father carried, hammers, nails, the rifle slung across his shoulder. Later, when he grew into his height, he had taken the tools himself, proud to match his father's stride, eager to prove that his hands could shape the land as well. She passed into the kitchen, the heart of their home. The table bore knife marks from countless meals, each scar a story of quick suppers between chores or long Sunday dinners when neighbors came by. She paused by the counter, running her fingers along the edge. It was here she had watched Daniel eat after long days outside, sunburned and tired but never complaining. He would grin through the ache in his shoulders, speaking of fence lines measured and posts set straight. He was barely more than a teenager when he began taking on work that belonged to grown men, insisting he could manage, and he had. The back door creaked when she opened it, revealing the yard where the fence line began. In her mind as she saw him again, broadening in frame, sleeves rolled to the elbow, sweat darkening his shirt as he dug holes and set posts with careful precision. His father had taught him that a fence was not just about keeping cattle in, but about claiming the work of their family, marking boundaries that no one else had the right to cross. Daniel had taken that lesson to heart, his hammer ringing steady against the valley wind. Eleanor stepped onto the porch, gripping the railing for support. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of sage and earth. Beyond the barn, she could see the line of fences stretching into darkness, though now many posts leaned, wires sagging, the work undone by years and neglect. She remembered the day he had finished a long stretch near the north pasture. He had come inside with his hands raw, dirt caked beneath his nails, but pride shone in his eyes. "It'll hold," he'd said simply, as though the strength of his labor was promise enough. That was the same year he enlisted. She remembered the talk in town, neighbors praising his courage while she kept her silence. At night, when the house settled and the coyotes called, she had wondered if the land itself had pushed him to seek something more. Building fences had taught him discipline, but perhaps it had also prepared him for lines drawn far beyond Red Valley, boundaries he would one day defend in other soil. Her steps took her to the stairwell, where the banister was smooth from his hand, sliding along it as he bounded down 2 steps at a time. Upstairs, the door to his old room remained half-closed. She pushed it open gently, the hinges groaning. The room was bare now, but she could still see the outlines of posters that once hung on the walls, the shadow of a bed pressed against one corner. In the closet, an old work shirt still hung, frayed at the cuffs, smelling faintly of hay and sweat. She pressed it to her face, breathing in what lingered, letting memory anchor her. Back downstairs, she moved toward the mantel once more. The unopened letters waited there, silent companions to the echoes that filled her night. She lowered herself into her chair, the rifle still within reach, and stared into the darkness. The town thought her fragile. The outlaws thought her defenseless. But the walls of the house held another truth. This was a place her son had built strength, post by post, line by line. She felt that strength even now, echoing through her bones, urging her to endure. The valley outside was quiet, but not empty. Every creak of the house, every mark of his labor, spoke back to her, reminding her that she had not been left with nothing. Daniel's presence lingered in the fences and in her memory, as real as the threats circling closer. She folded her hands in her lap, steady despite the tremor, and whispered into the stillness, "It'll hold." The evening shadows had lengthened across the ranch house, stretching long fingers through the lace curtains until they touched the mantel above the cold fireplace. Eleanor sat alone in the parlor, the rifle resting by her chair, her cane leaning against a wall within reach. The room smelled faintly of dust and old wood polish, untouched for years except by her steady hand with a cloth. Above the hearth, where the letters sat bound by twine, there was another relic that drew her eyes tonight, a photograph in a brass frame, its glass smudged by time and touch. She rose slowly, steadying herself at the arm of the chair, and crossed to the mantel. Her fingers brushed the frame, lifting it carefully as though it were made of glass itself. The photograph showed Daniel in uniform, his Delta Force fatigues pressed sharp, his beret tilted just so, his expression serious but not without warmth. His eyes were the same ones she had known since he was a boy, focused, disciplined, but carrying a depth of kindness he never allowed the world to harden. She traced the edge of his jawline with her thumb across the glass, remembering the day the picture was taken. It had been before his last deployment. He had come home for a brief leave, carrying the weight of faraway places and a set of shoulders. They had sat together at the kitchen table, the morning sun spilling to the window, coffee cooling untouched between them. He had worn the uniform for photograph only because she asked him to. He would have preferred plain clothes to blend into the ordinary rhythm of home, but she wanted one clear image of him as he was in the life he had chosen. She had told him that someday she might need to look into those eyes to steady herself, and he had obliged, though with a faint smile tugging at his lips. That morning, before leaving again, he had rested his hand over hers on the table. His voice had been calm, certain, carrying the authority of a man who had faced danger, but also the tenderness of a son speaking to his mother. "I'll always come home," he had said. The words had rooted themselves in her, as deep and unshakable as the fence posts he had set in the valley years earlier. She had carried them through sleepless nights, through rumors of battles, through letters left unopened for fear of what they might reveal. Now, standing in the quiet parlor, she studied the photograph and repeated those words under her breath. "I'll always come home." Her voice trembled, but the sound steadied her more than silence ever could. The promise was both comfort and torment. Comfort, because it meant she was not forgotten. Torment, because each day that passed without his return stretched the vow thinner, testing its strength against the uncertainty of distance. She turned the frame slightly, catching the reflection of lamplight across the glass. In that reflection, she saw herself beside him, an old woman with lined face and silver hair, standing next to the strong young man who carried the weight of his nation on his shoulders. It was as though time itself had folded, placing them together in one fragile moment. Her thumb pressed against the glass again, willing the image to bridge the years between them. Eleanor carried the photograph back to her chair and sat, the rifle still near, the letters still waiting. She propped the frame on her lap, letting the lamplight illuminate Daniel's face. Outside, the wind rose faintly, rattling the loose board of the porch, but she did not turn her head. Her eyes remained locked on her son's, drawing from them the same strength she had seen when he was 18, when he built fences under burning sun without complaint. The gang's threats, the broken glass, the painted barn, all of it pressed against her tonight. Yet the photograph stood as a counterweight. It reminded her of the line he had drawn in their last conversation. Home was not just a place. He had said, it was the people who refused to surrender it. She whispered again, the words he had given her, the words she clung to as though they might keep the walls standing. "I'll always come home." Her hand lingered on the frame until her fingers ached. Then she set it carefully on the table beside her. The house was still, but her resolve was steadier. Whatever waited in the dark, she would endure it as she had endured everything else, with the memory of his voice in her ears and the promise of his return rooted deep in her heart. The day was clear. The sky stretched wide over the valley, a sharp blue broken only by the slow drift of clouds. Eleanor sat on the porch with her shawl over her shoulders, the rifle resting against the wall behind her, a presence as constant as the cane she leaned on. She had swept away most of the broken glass, though the window frame remained empty, letting the wind push through the house with a low whistle. The barn door still bore the black mark of paint, and each time she looked toward it, her jaw tightened. She had expected them to come again. She had not expected they would do so in daylight. The sound reached her before she saw them, engines growling low, tires grinding the dirt road, mingling with the steady rhythm of hooves. She turned her head slowly, eyes narrowing against the sun. A small group came into view, 4 men on motorcycles, 2 more on horseback, their movements unhurried, as though they had all the time in the world. Dust lifted in their wake, shimmering in the heat. They did not stop at the gate this time. They pushed through the open posts, riding up the long track until they drew level with the porch. Eleanor did not rise. She remained seated, her cane across her knees, her gaze fixed steady on them. One of the bikers killed his engine and swung a leg over the seat. He was younger than she expected, no more than 30, though his face carried the hardened lines of someone long familiar with violence. He carried a folder under his arm, thick with papers. Behind him, another laughed, spitting into the dirt, while the riders on horseback fanned out near the barn, their eyes scanning the property as though it already belonged to them. The man with the folder climbed the steps to her porch with a swagger that made the old boards creak under his boots. He stopped just short of her chair, flipping the folder open. His tone was smooth practice, the voice of someone used to speaking with false politeness. "Mrs. Briggs, isn't it? We thought it was time to make this simple for you. No need for broken windows or missing cattle anymore. We've drawn up papers. All you need to do is sign, and this land stops being your problem." He held out a pen as though he were offering her a kindness. The folder he opened revealed documents stamped and typed, signatures already in place. They had come prepared, their confidence plain. The men behind him chuckled, as if the matter were already decided. Eleanor lifted her chin, her eyes never leaving his. Her hands trembled faintly, though not with fear. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the steel of 90 years hardened by the valley's winds. "This land is not for sale." The man's smile slipped, replaced by a thin edge of irritation. You misunderstand. This isn't a sale. This is survival. You're old, alone. You can't keep this place. We're giving you a way out. Sign the papers. Take the little bit of money we're offering, and you can live out your days in peace. Otherwise, he let the word hang, glancing back toward the barn where the black paint still glistened faintly. Eleanor's eyes flicked to the barn, then back to him. She did not move. Otherwise, you'll keep trying to scare me. You've already broken glass, stolen cattle, painted your marks like children scratching their names on a desk. You think that will drive me off? You don't know this land. You don't know me. For a moment, silence stretched between them. The man shifted his weight, tapping the pen against the folder. Behind him, one of the horsemen muttered, "She's wasting time," his voice edged with impatience. Another laugh, calling out, "Old bones don't last long. Best she signs before the wind knocks her down." Eleanor's hand slipped behind her chair. Her fingers brushing the stock of the rifle leaned there. She did not lift it, not yet, but the motion alone shifted the air. The man on the porch noticed. His eyes narrowed, his smile gone. He snapped the folder shut and straightened. "Think carefully, Mrs. Briggs." This was a polite ask. "Next time, we won't bother asking." He turned and descended the steps, the boards groaning under his boots. The riders regrouped, engines roaring, hooves pounding against the dirt. Dust rose in thick clouds as they pulled away, laughter trailing behind them like a foul wind. Eleanor sat unmoving, her hands still resting on the rifle, her eyes fixed on the road as they disappeared into the horizon. When the dust finally settled, the silence returned, heavier than before. The unsigned papers had left with them, but their meaning lingered. The threats were no longer hints carved into wood or symbols painted on barns. They had spoken plainly now. She was meant to give up, to surrender what her family had built, or face the consequences. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, the rifle across her lap, her heartbeat steady, her breath slow. She looked out across the fields, remembering her husband's words about fences holding only if the posts were set deep. Her son had learned that lesson with hammer and sweat. She would hold it now with will alone. They wanted her signature. What they would find instead was her silence, her refusal, and her ground held firm. The day they returned, the valley was bright with sun too harsh for comfort, the kind that bleached the fields and made the dust shimmer as if the earth itself was on fire. Eleanor had been sitting on the porch, as she often did, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, the old rifle leaning within reach. She had expected them. The folder papers had been their opening move, not their last, and she knew men like that never allowed a refusal to stand unanswered. The sound came first, carried on the wind, the low growl of engines, the uneven beat of hooves. She lifted her chin and watched the horizon. Dust rose like a storm in the distance, and soon the riders came into view. 6 again, maybe more, strung out across the road as if parading their ownership of it. Their confidence was loud, reckless, sharpened by the belief that fear would do most of their work for them. They did not slow at the gate. They pushed through, scattering gravel, their laughter cutting across the valley like the cry of scavenger birds. Eleanor stood before they reached the porch. Her cane steadied her, but her back was straight, her eyes level with the approaching men. With her other hand, she reached for the rifle, lifting it into the crook of her arm. The weapon was heavy, more than her aging body should have managed, but she held it as her husband once had, as her son still would if he were there. By the time the first rider cut his engine and swung off the bike, she was already waiting. "Well, now," he drawled, pulling his sunglasses down just far enough for his eyes to meet hers. "The old lady means business." Behind him, the others broke into laughter, harsh and mocking. One of the men on horseback leaned forward in his saddle, spitting into the dirt with exaggerated casualness. Another slapped the side of his leg, wheezing with amusement. To them, it was all performance, her age, her rifle, her defiance, a stage show they believed would collapse at the first shove. Eleanor said nothing at first. She simply adjusted her grip, shifting the barrel slightly so that its shadow cut across the steps. The movement, though small, quieted the laughter for a breath. She took that silence and filled it with her voice, clear and steady despite the tremor in her hands. "This land is mine. It was my husband's before me, and it was worked by my son before he left to serve this country. You will not take it from me. Not with paper, not with threats, not with fire. You may ride here, but you'll leave with nothing." Her words, spoken without hurry, settled heavier than she expected. The leader tilted his head, studying her. Then he barked a laugh, sudden and sharp, the others joining in like echoes. "Hear that?" he called to his men. "Grandma thinks she's a soldier." They howled with renewed laughter, one of them mimicking her stance with a crooked arm, another slapping the air as if waving a cane. Their cruelty filled the air, but beneath it there was something else, faint but present, a ripple of unease that came from the way she had not wavered. She did not plead. She did not explain. She stood. The leader climbed the first step of the porch, stopping short when the rifle lifted a fraction higher, the barrel steady in her arms. His smile faltered, but he masked it with bravado. "Careful now," he said, voice low enough only she could hear. "You pull that trigger, and we'll burn this place to the ground before you can blink." Eleanor's eyes did not leave his. "You'll burn it whether I stand or not," she replied. "So I'll stand." The man stared at her for a long moment, the weight of her words settling heavier than he wanted to admit. Finally, he stepped back, shaking his head, turning to the others. "She's stubborn. Let her have her fun. For now." The group erupted in more laughter, though forced this time, thinner at the edges. They mounted again, engines rumbling to life, horses pawing at the dirt. As they turned down the road, one of them shouted back, "Next time, Grandma, that barn won't be standing." Another added, "Hope your house is fireproof." Their laughter trailed into the valley as they disappeared in a cloud of dust. Eleanor lowered the rifle only after the sound faded. Her knees shook, her hands trembling with the weight of what she had done. But she did not collapse. She moved back to her chair, setting the rifle within reach once more. The porch board still carried the echo of their boots, but her stand remained. They had promised to return, and she knew they would. Yet in their laughter she had heard something new. Recognition that the widow of Red Valley would not go quietly. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of red. Eleanor sat in the fading light, her cane resting against her knee, the rifle across her lap, her heart steady. The valley was quiet again, but it was not the silence of defeat. It was the pause before the next storm. The night after the standoff on the porch, the house felt different. The board still bore the faint vibration of boots. The air still seemed to carry the echo of mocking laughter, and yet there was a heavier silence than before, one that pressed down against Eleanor's chest as she sat by the coal fireplace. The rifle rested nearby. Her cane leaned within reach, but even with those close at hand, she felt the fragile truth of her age more than ever. They had promised to return, and she knew they meant it. Her eyes wandered to the mantel where the letters lay bound in twine. For years they had remained unopened, each one a reminder of her son's distance, his life carved from places and battles she could not touch. She had dusted them, moved them, even held them against her chest when the loneliness was sharpest. But she had never broken the seal. Not once. To read them had always seemed too dangerous, as though the words inside might confirm her worst fears. Tonight, with the barn marked, the windows broken, and her stand made clear, she felt the weight of them called to her differently. Her hand trembled as she reached for the stack. The twine slipped free, and the letters scattered across the mantel in a loose fan. She chose the one on top, the envelope yellow but unbroken, his handwriting neat and firm. Slowly, carefully, she slid her finger under the flap. The sound of paper tearing was louder than she expected, sharp against the silence. She unfolded the page inside, smoothing the creases against her knee, her eyes blurring for a moment before the words came clear. "Dear Mom," it began, the ink pressed deep from the careful wave of his pen. "I don't know where I'll be when you read this, but I hope it finds you at home, with the valley still quiet and the fences holding." Her throat tightened and she paused, breathing slowly before reading on. "I remember every inch of that land. I remember the fence posts we set together, the way Dad showed me how to measure twice before driving the nail. I carry that with me still. Out here, we draw lines in the sand. We build walls with more than wood and wire. But it's the same lesson. You hold the ground you're given, and you don't let anyone take it from you." Her eyes filled, the words shimmering, but she forced herself to keep reading. "I know you worry. I know you're afraid of what news might come. But I want you to hear me clearly. I'll always come home. Maybe not quickly, maybe not in the way you expect, but I will. You raised me to keep my promises, and that's one I'll never break. Until I walk back through that door, I need you to stay strong. You're tougher than you think, tougher than anyone gives you credit for. You've carried more than most soldiers ever will." She pressed the paper against her chest, her shoulders shaking with the force of memory. His words carried the steady cadence of his voice, calm and sure, the same tone he had used when he was a boy learning to steady a hammer or a man readying himself to leave. She let the silence of the house wrap around the letter, letting every line soak deep into her bones. At the bottom of the page, he had written a final note, smaller, more personal. "If trouble ever comes, remember this. You're not alone. Even if I'm far away, I'm with you in the fences, in the fields, in the boards of that old porch. Stand your ground. Mom, you taught me how." The words blurred again as she traced them with her finger. The letter shook in her hands, but not from fear this time. Something within her steadied, a spark of the strength he had seen in her long before she admitted it to herself. She folded the page carefully, laying it on the table beside the rifle, not back on the mantel with the others. This one belonged close, ready when she needed to read it again. Outside, the coyotes cried in the distance, their voices thin against the wide valley. Eleanor rose slowly, leaning on her cane, and looked out the broken window toward the barn. The black mark still glistened faintly in the moonlight, a symbol meant to frighten her into surrender. But with her son's words pressed into her heart, it seemed less a curse and more a challenge. She whispered aloud, her voice carrying steady despite her frailty. "You'll find me standing." The house returned to silence, but it no longer felt empty. The letter's presence filled the room, as though Daniel's promise breathed through the walls themselves. She sat again, the rifle by her side, the letter within arm's reach. The night was no less dangerous, but her fear had been cut with steel. The valley had shifted. Tomorrow would bring them again, but tomorrow she would meet them with more than defiance. She would meet them with his words at her back, carrying the weight of a promise that had never broken. The night settled heavy over Red Valley, the kind that pressed the stars low and wrapped the house in a blanket of stillness too fragile to trust. Eleanor sat in her chair by the broken window, the letter from Daniel folded neatly on the table beside her, the rifle across her lap. The lamps were unlit, leaving the rooms in shadow. She had learned long ago that darkness could be a shield, that sometimes it was better to watch unseen than to move in the open. The silence was nearly complete, broken only by the faint ticking of the old clock above the door. Then, faint at first, came the sound, a low rumble carried on the wind, so distant it could have been mistaken for a storm brewing in the hills. But it grew louder, uneven, joined by the staccato rhythm of hooves striking hard-packed dirt, engines and horses together, an unnatural chorus, rolling steadily closer. Eleanor straightened, her thin fingers tightening on the rifle stock. She did not move toward the door. She waited, listening. The first headlights appeared over the ridge, beams cutting across the valley in harsh lines. Motorcycles roared down the road, their riders leaning forward like shadows fused machines. Behind them came horses, their silhouettes dark against the pale moon, riders upright in their saddles, rifles slung casually across their shoulders. Dust rose behind the group, a shroud that followed them as they closed the distance. They did not stop at the gate. They spread out, encircling the property in a slow, deliberate pattern, engines revving, hooves pounding, as if the reminder the house was no longer an island but prey surrounded by predators. Eleanor rose carefully, cane in one hand, rifle in the other, and moved to the porch. The boards creaked under her weight, but her back remained straight. From her vantage, she watched as they circled, their laughter sharp, carried on the night air like broken glass. One of the motorcycles swung close to the barn, its headlights sweeping across the painted symbol, illuminating the black lines like a banner. The rider whooped and let off the throttle, spinning the rear wheel until gravel sprayed against the wood. A gunshot cracked, sudden and violent. The sound echoed off the valley walls, rolling back upon itself. Another followed, then another, each fired into the air, a display meant not to kill but to claim. The horses reared at the noise, riders holding their reins tight, shouting in harsh voices. The men laughed louder, the chaos feeding itself. Shells clinked against the dirt, faint metallic notes lost under the thunder of engines. Eleanor held her ground. She did not raise a rifle to her shoulder, though her hands gripped it firmly. She stared out across the chaos, her expression calm but unyielding. Each shot cut through her, not in fear but in memory. Of wars fought far from here, of news clippings she refused to read, of her son's letters unopened until now. She thought of his words, "Hold the ground you're given." She whispered them to herself as the night flared with muzzle flashes and headlights sweeping across her walls. The riders made wide loops, passing close to the porch before veering away, mocking her with every turn. One shouted, "Still standing, Grandma? Thought you'd be gone by now." Another let out a shrill whistle, followed by a volley of gunfire that tore into the air above the house. Glass fell from another window, shattering across the porch boards at her feet. She did not step back. The noise went on for what felt like hours, though in truth it was only minutes. The display was meant to wear her down, to break her will as surely as the cattle theft and the painted barn. But when the riders finally pulled together, circling once more before peeling off into the dark, they found her unmoved. Eleanor stood on the porch, the rifle in her hand, her figure outlined by moonlight against the battered house. The engines faded into the distance. The hoofbeats diminished to nothing, and the valley swallowed the sound as though it had never been disturbed. Dust hung in the air long after, drifting in lazy spirals that glowed faintly in the moonlight. Eleanor lowered the rifle and sat once more in her chair, her breathing even, though her heart beat fiercely beneath her shawl. The house bore new wounds, but it still stood. So, did she? She reached for the letter on the table, unfolded again, and read the final line by lamplight this time. "Asterisk, stand your ground, Mom. You taught me how." Asterisk, the word steadied her against the echo of gunfire still ringing in her ears. She folded the page carefully, placed it against her chest, and whispered into the silence of the valley, "I'm still here." The night pressing again, quieter now, as if waiting for the next move. Eleanor sat in the dark, the rifle leaning close, the letter closer still. Whatever storm the gang intended to bring, she would meet it the same way she had met this one, with her ground held firm and the memory of her son's promise breathing strength into her tired bones. The desert sun bore down on the camp with a weight that turned the ground into shimmering glass. Dust clung to every surface, grinding into the fabric of uniforms, coating the metal of vehicles lined in neat rows. Major Daniel Briggs stood near the edge of the motor pool, his sleeves rolled high, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning over maintenance reports while mechanics worked in the background. The rhythm of deployment was unrelenting. Rotations, patrols, equipment checks, endless hours of vigilance. It left little space for thought beyond the present mission. But that morning, something broke through the routine. A young courier jogged across the lot, an envelope clutched in his hand, his boots scattering sand with every stride. He slowed as he reached Daniel, offering a crisp salute before extending the envelope. "Sir, this just came to the channel for you." His voice carried a trace of unease, as though the delivery bore more than ordinary weight. Daniel accepted it, his brow furrowing at the sight of the seal. The return address was not military. It was official, but from back home. He opened it in silence, the paper crackling under his hands. The words were spare, direct, an update that had crossed more desks than he wanted to imagine. It spoke of disturbances on his family's property in Red Valley, of incidents escalating from vandalism to threats, of the sheriff's limited ability to intervene. It did not speak of his mother's name with detail, but Daniel knew. He could picture her there, the old house, the barn scarred with paint, the pastures too quiet. His jaw tightened as he folded the paper slowly, his eyes fixed on the horizon though his mind was thousands of miles away. For a long moment, he said nothing. Around him, the noise of the camp continued. Engines turning over, voices shouting across the lot, the metallic clang of tools on steel. But his silence drew attention. A fellow officer paused nearby, studying his face. Finally, Daniel walked toward the command tent, his steps purposeful, his grip on the folded paper steady. Inside, the tent was cooler, the hum of a generator filling the air. His commander sat behind a table cluttered with maps and radios, reading reports by lamplight. He looked up as Daniel entered, his eyes narrowing at the expression on the younger man's face. Daniel placed the folded paper on the table, without a word. The commander read it quickly, then leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "So it's reached her doorstep," he murmured, half to himself. He tapped the paper with 2 fingers, then looked up. "She's 90 years old, living alone. I imagine you've been waiting for this kind of word." Daniel said nothing at first. His voice, when it came, was low but firm. "She's all I have left, sir. If I don't go now, there may not be a home to go back to." The commander studied him for a long moment, weighing more than the request. Daniel had served long, with distinction, rarely asking for anything outside the demands of the mission. The lines on his face told of discipline and endurance. But now there was something else there, a resolve that came from a place deeper than duty. Finally, the commander leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Officially, I can't just pull you mid-rotation, without layers of approval. But unofficially," he paused, choosing his words with care, "you've earned leave, more than most. I'll make the calls. Quietly, you'll be on a plane by tomorrow night." Daniel inclined his head, the gratitude in his eyes unspoken but clear. He straightened his posture, saluted, and turned to leave, the paper still folded tight in his hand. Outside, the desert air hit him again, dry and sharp. He looked across the rows of vehicles, the tents, the men moving with steady purpose, and felt the pull of 2 worlds tearing at him. One demanded his service. The other, far across the ocean, demanded his presence in a way no mission could replace. That night, as he sat on his cot in the barracks, he unfolded one of his own letters, written weeks earlier but never mailed. In it, he had told his mother he was safe, that the days were long but manageable, that he thought often of the ranch and the fences he once built. He stared at the unfinished words, then folded it again, sliding it into his pack. The time for letters was over. The time for returning had come. He lay back, staring at the canvas ceiling above him, listening to the muted sounds of the camp settling for the night. His mother's image filled his mind, not fragile, but firm, seated on the porch with a rifle across her knees, holding ground against men who believed her too weak to resist. He closed his eyes, steadying his breath. Tomorrow, he would begin the journey home. The first light of dawn broke across Red Valley in pale streaks of pink and gold, painting the horizon with quiet promise of another long day. The bus station sat on the edge of town, little more than a squat building of brick and fading paint, its wooden benches worn smooth by decades of waiting travelers. A stray dog dozed under one of the benches, lifting its head briefly as the hiss of brakes cut through the morning stillness. The bus rolled in with a tired groan, its sides streaked with dust from the miles it carried through empty highways and forgotten towns. Daniel Briggs rose from his seat near the middle, his broad shoulders nearly brushing the overhead rack as he reached up for his duffel. He wore plain clothes, jeans, boots scuffed from years of use, and a dark shirt that hid the frame of a man hardened by service. His hair was cut short, his jaw rough with the beginnings of a beard. Nothing about him marked rank or medals, but everything about him carried the weight of someone who had lived where few men dared. He slung the duffel over one shoulder, the straps settling into a groove worn by years of carrying packs heavier than most could imagine. As the doors folded open, he stepped down onto the cracked pavement. The cool air of morning hit him, clean in a way that foreign deserts never were, filled with the scent of dust, sage, and distant cattle. He paused, just for a breath, letting the quiet of home settle over him. The valley stretched far beyond the station, the hills still dark against the rising sun. It was the same land he had left, and yet it felt changed, heavier with the knowledge of what waited at the ranch. The few townsfolk who gathered for the early bus spared him curious glances. They saw only a man returning, nothing more. No one knew he had left behind a uniform stitch of the history he rarely spoke of, or that the duffel on his back held not only clothes, but the discipline of years lived on the edge of survival. He walked past them without a word, his boots steady on the worn boards of the station steps. Outside, the streets were quiet. Shops stood shuttered, their signs creaking faintly in the breeze. A pickup rattled by, the driver lifting 2 fingers in a gesture of recognition, though Daniel doubted the man knew who he was. The town carried on its rhythm, whispering about the trouble on his mother's land, but none expected the son to come walking back at dawn. He adjusted the duffel and turned down the road toward the outskirts. Each step carried the weight of memory. He remembered running the same path as a boy, his boots smaller, but his stride already steady. He remembered his father's hand on his shoulder, teaching him to measure the ground before setting a post, and his mother's voice calling him in for supper when the light had faded. Now, the road felt longer, the fences older, the air sharper. The past seemed to fold into the present with every mile. When he reached the rise that looked down over the ranch, he stopped. The sight hit him harder than any battlefield. The barn doors bore the black mark he had heard of. The house's broken window gaped like an unhealed wound. The fences sagged, fields too quiet where cattle once grazed. But the porch stood as it always had, weatherboards holding steady. And there, small against the weight of all, sat his mother in her chair, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her cane at her side. The rifle leaned close within her reach. She did not rise when she saw him. Instead, she straightened, her eyes fixed, her hands folding in her lap to still their trembling. Daniel's steps grew quicker as he crossed the yard, the dust rising behind him. When he mounted the porch, he dropped the duffel at his feet, the sound of it hitting the board sharp in the morning air. "Mom," he said simply, her lips parted, her breath catching. For a moment, words failed her. She reached out, her hand brushing against his arm, as if to test whether he was real. Then, in a voice both soft and steady, she whispered, "You came home." Daniel nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the scars of the ranch before returning to her face. "I told you I would." The valley lay quiet around them, the sun climbing higher, spilling light across a land both wounded and waiting. Daniel bent to lift his duffel again, carrying it inside, his presence filling the house with a strength it had not known in years. The ranch was no longer alone. Neither was she. The old house seemed to breathe differently once Daniel crossed its threshold. The boards under his boots groaned as though they recognized him. The air carrying the faint scent of dust, cedar, and something older, something tied to years his family had worked the land. He set his duffel by the door, his shoulders easing but his eyes sharp, scanning every corner, every scar of recent trouble. Behind him, Eleanor moved slowly with her cane, her shawl gathered tight, as if holding herself together with cloth and will alone. She wanted to stand straighter, to greet him not as a frail old woman, but as the mother who had once sent him into the world with strength. Yet the moment lingered, too heavy for disguise. Her breath came uneven. Her hands trembled despite her grip on the cane. For years she had carried herself alone, sitting on that porch with a rifle as her only companion. Now, with him here, she felt the weight slipping from her bones, leaving her bare in ways she had not expected. Daniel turned to her, his face lined by sun and distance, but softened in the eyes. He reached out, steadying her as she eased into her chair by the hearth. She resisted at first, the pride that had kept her standing in the face of outlaws unwilling to yield, but the warmth of his hand against hers broke through the wall she had built. She let him guide her into the seat, the fireless grate yawning wide before them. For a moment neither spoke. The silence stretched, filled only by the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. Daniel's gaze moved to the letters stacked neatly beside it, one unfolded and worn from recent touch. He brushed the page with his fingers, recognizing his own handwriting, his promise carried across oceans. His jaw tightened, then relaxed, as though the sight both hurt and steadied him. "You opened one," he said quietly. Eleanor nodded, her voice roughened by age and unspilled tears. "I had to." They came again, circling the house, firing into the air like children with no fear of consequence. "I read your words that night. They kept me steady." Daniel lowered himself onto the stool across from her, his broad frame filling the small room. He studied her carefully, noting the tremor in her hands, the lines carved deeper by years of solitude and strain. "You shouldn't have had to face them alone," he said. "I did what I had to," she replied. Her chin lifted a fraction, the stubbornness that had carried her surfacing even now. "This land has been ours for generations. I wasn't about to let them scare me off." Her strength, though real, could not mask the relief etched into her expression. She had feared each day might be her last stand, that the porch might be the place where she finally yielded. Now, with him sitting across from her, she felt the deep ache of years without him and the fragile joy of his return. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his voice steady but low. "They won't touch this place again. Not while I'm here." The words settled over her like a weight lifted. She reached for his hand, her fingers thin and trembling, his calloused and firm. She held on tightly, as if afraid he might vanish if she let go. "I knew you'd come," she whispered. "Even when I doubted, I knew." The morning light filtered through the broken window, casting long bars of gold across the floor. Dust motes floated in the beams, slow and silent. In that light, Eleanor allowed herself a moment of weakness. Her shoulders sagged, her eyes brimmed, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. She did not brush it away. Daniel reached across the space, wiping it gently with his thumb, the gesture simple but carrying the weight of all the years between them. They sat together in silence, her relief plain, his presence a promise. The valley outside was scarred, the ranch marked by those who sought to claim it, but inside the house, mother and son were reunited. The strength she had borrowed from his words was now returned to her in flesh and bone. And though she tried to appear strong, Daniel saw the truth in her trembling hands and the shine in her eyes. It was not weakness. It was love carried through the hardest winters, finally allowed to rest. Daniel rose before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, the habit of early rising etched into him by years of service and years before that, working beside his father in the same soil. The house was still, his mother asleep in her chair after a night of rest that had been the first real one in weeks. He stepped outside quietly, the screen door groaning just enough to announce his leaving. The valley air was sharp, cool, carrying the scent of dry earth and sage. He set his boots onto the dirt path and began walking the land. The first place he stopped was a barn. Its doors loomed in the gray half-light, scarred with black paint that had hardened into cracked ridges. The symbol glared back at him, crude but unmistakable, a mark of ownership claimed by men who had no right to it. Daniel laid his hand against the wood, feeling the burn marks beneath the paint. He had seen symbols like this before in villages overseas, signs left behind by gangs or warlords staking claims they could not hold. It was always the same tactic. Intimidation first, destruction second, then dominance. He stepped back, studying the structure itself. The hinges sagged where the riders had rammed them. The boards splintered from boot kicks. Repairs would take time and lumber, but the barn was not lost. Not yet. From there, he followed the fence line. It ran ragged, the wire slack in places, posts leaning or missing altogether. He crouched beside one of the breaks, running his fingers over the cut in the metal. It wasn't rust or accident. Someone had taken pliers or bolt cutters to it. Deliberate, methodical. He straightened, his eyes narrowing toward the open pasture. In the distance, a patch of ground was churned with hoof prints not belonging to their herd. Strangers had driven the cattle out, corralled them somewhere else. Theft, not hunger, was the motive. He made a mental note of every gap, every weakness, the way he would have logged vulnerable points on patrol. Further along the northern line, he found another message. A fence post carved deep, the knife marks fresh. Crude words gouged into the wood. "Leave now." He traced the letters with one callous thumb, his jaw tightening. These men were escalating. He had read enough of them in foreign soil to know this was not idle cruelty. It was strategy. Fear was meant to do the work before the fire and the bullets came. He looked out across the valley and let the anger steady him, not blind him. Fear was their weapon. He would not let his mother hold it alone any longer. He circled back toward the yard, the ground beneath his boots telling its own story. Tire tracks gouged deep near the drive, arcs of rubber burned into the dirt where motorcycles had spun circles for show. Scattered shell casings glittered faintly in the light, left behind like trophies. He stooped, picking one up between thumb and forefinger, rolling it until the spent primer caught the rising sun. Fired into the air, yes, but next time, the angle could change. He dropped it into his pocket. Evidence and a reminder. At the porch, he stopped to study the boards. Scratches marred the steps where boots had dragged, marks left behind by men who had come too close to his mother's chair. The image of her standing there, cane in one hand, rifle in the other, seared into him. She had held them off, but the boards told him how near they had come. He knelt, running his hand over the worn wood, then rose slowly, scanning the horizon once more. Daniel finished his circuit by the corral. The gate had been forced open, hinges twisted. The troughs were overturned, as though the intruders had taken amusement in spoiling what little water remained. He righted one of them, his movements efficient, unhurried. He noted each detail, each wound dealt to land, not to dwell, but to prepare. His training had taught him that knowing the ground was the first step to holding it. By the time he returned to the porch, the sun was high enough to throw long beams across the valley. The ranch looked battered, scarred by the hands of men who believed intimidation could wear down a 90-year-old woman. But Daniel saw it differently. He saw a map of their methods, a record of their arrogance. And as he stood with his arms crossed, dust rising from his boots, he knew one thing with certainty. They had underestimated not only his mother, but the land itself. Inside, he heard the floorboard shift as Eleanor stirred awake. Daniel stepped through the doorway, his voice calm but edged with resolve. "I've walked it all," he said. "They've done their damage, but they haven't taken a thing worth keeping. Not yet, and they won't." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a soldier cataloging a battlefield. The land was not lost. It was only waiting to be defended. The morning light crept through the fractured window, laying broken stripes across the parlor floor. Eleanor sat in her chair, her shawl wrapped tight, her hands folded in her lap to hide their tremor. She had not spoken since Daniel returned from his walk around the property, though her eyes followed him as he moved about the room, his presence filling it in a way that made the old house feel alive again. He set his duffel by the wall, checked the rifle leaning near her chair, then crouched to right a loose board near the hearth. It was a rhythm of man assessing, repairing, preparing, but she felt the weight of silence pressing on her chest, heavier than the threats scrawled on fence posts. Finally, she broke it. Her voice was soft at first, as though unused to sharing what had long lived only in her thoughts. "I haven't slept, Daniel. Not truly. Not for months." He stilled, his hand resting on the board, and lifted his eyes to her. She met his gaze with difficulty, her own clouded by fatigue and something deeper. "Every night I've sat here listening," she continued. "Listening for engines, for hooves, for glass breaking, for men shouting in the dark. I hear them even when they aren't here. Sometimes it's the coyotes, sometimes the wind through the barn boards, but it all sounds like them. I don't close my eyes anymore, without fearing I won't open them again in my own house." Her hands twisted the edge of the shawl, her words spilling in uneven rhythm. "They don't just take cattle or break fences. They take peace. They take the quiet nights that used to be mine. And I've been so tired, Daniel, so tired of being alone in the dark with their laughter still in my ears." Daniel rose slowly, crossing the floor with the deliberate calm of a man who had heard confessions like this before, though never from his own mother. He crouched beside her chair, his presence steady, grounding. His hand covered hers, prying gently at the shawl until she allowed him to hold her fingers instead. "Mom," he said, his voice low but firm, "that ends now." She looked at him, searching his face, trying to measure if the promise could carry more weight than her fear. "You don't know how strong they think they are," she whispered. "I know exactly how strong they think they are," he answered. "I've seen men like them in villages halfway across the world. They roar and they threaten because they believe no one will stand against them. But they don't know what it means to face someone who has nothing left to fear." He paused, squeezing her hand lightly. "And you won't face them alone anymore." The words hung between them, not as comfort alone, but as a binding vow. Eleanor let her shoulders sag, the weight of months of vigilance easing slightly. Her eyes glistened, though no tears fell. She nodded once, the smallest motion, but enough. Daniel rose again, his frame casting a long shadow across the room as he moved to the window. He looked out at the scar barn doors, the broken fence posts in the distance, the marks of violation that had stolen her peace. "They've had their time to scare you," he said, almost to himself. "Now it's our turn to remind them this land isn't theirs to take." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, exhaustion pulling at her, but with it came something different, a fragile thread of relief. For the first time in many nights, she allowed her eyes to close, even briefly, trusting that the house no longer stood unguarded. The rifle still leaned beside her, but now it felt lighter, less of a burden. Her son was here. His words carried the certainty she had needed, the promise she could finally believe. Daniel watched her for a moment, her breathing steadying as sleep tugged at her edges. He adjusted the blanket over her shoulders, his touch gentle, almost reverent. Then he moved quietly through the house, checking each window, each door, his soldier's eye cataloging every entry, every weakness. His mother would sleep, even if only for a short while, and he would see to it that nothing disturbed her rest. Outside, the valley lay wide and silent, the scars of intrusion still visible, but the balance had shifted. The ranch was no longer defended by a single woman holding a rifle against the night. It was defended by a son who had promised long ago he would always come home. And now, with her confession laid bare and his vows spoken aloud, the silence of the valley no longer felt fragile. It felt like the calm before something certain. The valley carried heat by midday, the kind that shimmered above the dirt road and pressed sweat into the collar. Eleanor sat on the porch, her shawl folded neatly across her lap, though she needed it less for warmth than for habit. The rifle leaned beside her as always, but this time Daniel stood a few feet away, his stance easy but alert, the weight of his presence filling the space where fear had once lived. He scanned the horizon with the practiced calm of a man who had spent years waiting for trouble to show itself. When it came, it did not creep quietly. Engines cracked the silence first, followed by the sharp rhythm of hooves. Dust rose at the far edge of the road, curling into the sky like smoke. Eleanor's grip tightened on her shawl, but Daniel's shoulders remained still, his jaw set. The gang rode into view, half a dozen men, maybe more, their bikes rumbling low, horses pacing beside them, laughter already carrying on the wind. They had come expecting to find the same frail widow they had mocked and threatened, the same porch where their jeers had rung loud. What they found instead was her son. The motorcycle slowed as they neared the gate, the riders fanning out with show of bravado. A few revved their engines. Others called out crude greetings, their confidence rolling over the valley like thunder. The horsemen hung back, grinning, rifles resting casually across their saddles. The leader dismounted, swagger heavy in his stride, and walked toward the porch, his eyes fixed on Daniel, studying him with curiosity and the faintest hint of suspicion. "Well, now," the man drawled, pulling his sunglasses down to better see. "Didn't expect company. Who are you supposed to be?" "The hired help." Daniel didn't answer right away. He let the silence hang, his gaze steady, unreadable, the kind of gaze that did not need words to speak. When he did answer, his voice was calm, low, and clear. "This is my home." The laughter came again, though not as full as before. The men glanced at each other, smirking, jostling for the performance of their own courage. The leader tilted his head, measuring. "Your home? Huh? Funny. Looks like it's been falling apart under the care of your mother. We were just doing her a favor, helping her find the sense to let it go. But if you're here," he spread his arms as though offering hospitality, "maybe you'll be the one to sign those papers." Daniel didn't move, didn't blink. His voice stayed even. "You've already made enough mistakes here. You won't make another." The shift was subtle, but it was there. The easy amusement in their faces flickered, replaced by a thread of unease. They had seen defiance before, from the widow who stood with her cane and rifle, but this was different. The man before them was steady in a way that unnerved them, the kind of steadiness that did not bluff. One of the riders spat into the dirt, muttering, "He talks big." Another called out from the saddle, "Old soldier come home to play cowboy?" Laughter followed again, forced louder this time, as though to drown out the quiet weight of Daniel's presence. Eleanor's hand hovered over the rifle beside her, but Daniel gave her a small shake of his head, barely a motion at all. He stepped forward instead, down the porch steps, the dust rising around his boots. He stood at the edge of the yard, close enough that the men could see the calm in his eyes, the certainty in his posture. "I'm not here to play," he said. "I'm here to finish what you started." The words cut sharper than any raised voice. The leader's grin faltered, his hand tightening on the folder still tucked under his arm, the one he had brought as if intimidation could wear down a family's will. He opened his mouth, but nothing came at first. The engines idled, the horses pawed the ground, and the valley waited. For the first time, their laughter died without command. It wasn't fear yet, not fully, but it was a recognition of something they hadn't expected. They had come to mock and pressure an old widow. Instead, they had walked into the steady gaze of a man who had faced far worse than them and returned home standing tall. Daniel took another step forward, his eyes never leaving theirs. "You've had your run of this land. That ends today. Ride away, and maybe you'll have a chance to forget you ever came here." The silence that followed was heavier than their laughter had ever been. Dust swirled in hot air, engines rumbled low, but no one spoke. The leader's smirk returned. Then at this time, his bravado cracked at the edges. He swung back toward his bike, covering his hesitation with a shrug. "We'll be seeing you, soldier," he muttered. The gang turned slowly, their formation less sure as they headed down the road. They did not speed off with bravado this time. Their dust cloud was thinner, their laughter gone. Eleanor exhaled, her shoulders sagging for the first time since they appeared. Daniel stood at the edge of the yard until the sound of engines and hooves vanished into the distance. Only then did he return to the porch, his expression unchanged. "They'll be back," Eleanor whispered, her voice taut with worry. "Yes," Daniel answered, his tone firm, almost calm. "But next time, they won't leave so easily." The valley settled into silence once more, but it was not the silence of fear. It was a silence that comes before a storm, steady and waiting. Daniel waited until the last trace of the Outlaws' dust had disappeared over the ridge before turning back toward the porch. Eleanor still sat in her chair, the shawl clutched against her chest, her eyes following him with a mixture of relief and dread. He touched her shoulder gently, grounding her with that small gesture, then lifted his duffel from where it rested against the wall. Without a word, he carried it inside and set it on the dining table, the wood creaking under its weight. The zipper rasped loudly in the still house, and from a bag, he began to draw items one by one. A coil of heavy rope, neatly wound and worn from use. 2 knives, their blades clean but honed to a fine edge. A tactical flashlight with a cracked casing, still functional despite years of service. A compact field kit with tools arranged in tight order, the kind of kit built for improvisation in places where nothing could be relied on but what you carried. He laid each item out with the same precision he had learned overseas, transforming the table from a piece of furniture into a workspace. Eleanor watched quietly from the doorway, leaning on her cane. Her eyes lingered on the knives, then on the rope, then back to her son. "I always knew you carried yourself different," she murmured. "Even as a boy, I didn't know you'd bring the war home with you." Daniel looked up at her, his face steady. "I'm not bringing it home. It was already here. I'm just meeting it on your terms." She nodded faintly and sank into the nearest chair, her body heavy with months of weariness. He returned to the task, hands moving with quiet confidence. He cut the rope into measured lengths, tying knots with quick, deliberate flicks of his wrists. Each knot was tested, pulled tight, then set aside. He checked the flashlight, its beam piercing through the dimness, then dimmed it to a low setting suitable for concealment. The knives he sheathed in leather straps, tested the edges, then slid them back into place. His preparation carried no flourish, only function. When the tools were ready, he stepped back outside into the fading light. The valley stretched before him, scarred but familiar. Where others might see only broken fences and painted barn doors, he saw angles, blind spots, routes of approach. He began to move the way he had once moved through villages half a world away, cataloging lines of sight, mapping distances in his head. The sagging fences became markers, the barn doors became shields, The troughs became obstacles. The land was farmland, yes, but in his eyes it was also ground to be held. He tested the rope on the posts, securing trip lines that were invisible unless searched for, each one positioned to slow or unseat a rider. He fixed a line across a corral gate, the knots hidden behind weathered wood. Near the porch, he set a crude alarm with empty cans strung together, the old soldier's version of a perimeter sensor. What looked like harmless clutter to anyone passing would become noise enough to wake him if they came in the night. The flashlight he tested again near the barn, angling its beam across the ground to catch reflections off glass or metal. He mapped the shadows the barn would cast once night fell, memorizing where he could move unseen and where light would betray him. At the broken window, he reinforced the edges with boards, leaving just enough space to fire through if needed. The sun sank lower, turning the valley gold, then red, then a slow gray. Eleanor sat on the porch, watching him work. She saw the boy who had once dug fence posts until his palms bled, now moving with a soldier's certainty, turning their land into something unrecognizable but necessary. She said nothing, only nodded each time his eyes met hers, as if giving quiet approval. When the last knots were tied and the last line tested, Daniel returned to the porch. His hands were rough with dust, his shirt damp with sweat, but his eyes were sharp, alert. He dropped the remaining coil of rope beside his duffel, then lowered himself onto the step. Eleanor reached out with one hand, resting it lightly on his shoulder. "You've made this place ready," she said softly. He shook his head once. "I've made it harder for them. That's all, but it's enough for now." The silence of evening settled in, broken only by the faint call of coyotes in the hills. The house was still battered, the fences still broken. But for the first time in months, Eleanor allowed herself to breathe a little easier. The widow's land had been scarred by threats, but now it bore the imprint of her son's return, discipline, preparation, and a quiet promise that the next time laughter echoed through the valley, it would meet more than a trembling rifle and a weary heart. It would meet Daniel Briggs, steady and waiting. The night came down heavy, the kind of darkness that carried weight rather than relief. The valley lay quiet beneath it. Coyotes far off in the hills, the grass whispering under the touch of wind. Inside the ranch house, Eleanor slept in her chair near the hearth, exhaustion finally loosening its grip enough to give her peace. The rifle leaned beside her still, but her breathing was steady. Daniel sat on the porch, elbows on his knees, his eyes fixed on the tree line beyond the road. He had been trained to sense the shift in the air before trouble showed its face. Tonight, he felt it creeping closer. It began with the faint crunch of gravel under cautious boots. Not the bold roar of engines or the bray of laughter, but something slower, measured. Daniel's hand slid to the knife at his belt, his body lowering into the shadows near the porch railing. He caught movement, two figures breaking from the cover of brush. Crouched low, their outlines faint against the pale wash of moonlight. They carried crowbars and a sack between them. Their confidence plain away, they crept toward the side of the house. Daniel moved silently, the boards of the porch barely whispering under his weight. He slipped around the corner, keeping low, his breathing controlled. The men whispered to each other as they reached the window Eleanor had patched with boards. One tested the wood with the tip of his crowbar, pressing gently to judge how easily it might give. The other glanced over his shoulder toward the yard, oblivious to the figure watching from the darkness. With a speed born of long practice, Daniel closed the distance. His hand shot out, seizing the wrist of the man at the window. A sharp twist forced the crowbar from his grip, clattering harmlessly to the ground. Before the intruder could cry out, Daniel struck the back of his knee, dropping him silently into the dirt. A quick chokehold pressed him against the siding, his struggles weakening in seconds until he slumped unconscious at Daniel's feet. The second man turned, eyes wide, reaching for the knife at his belt. He barely had time to draw it before Daniel closed the gap. A sharp kick to the wrist sent the blade skittering into grass. The outlaw swung wildly with his free hand, but Daniel caught it, using the man's own momentum to slam him against the barn wall. The air rushed from his lungs in a grunt, his head striking with hard enough to daze him. Daniel pinned him there, forearm pressed against his throat, the man's feet scrabbling for purchase in the dirt. Quiet, Daniel hissed, his voice low and controlled. "Wake the valley and you won't walk away." The man froze, breath rattling in his chest. His eyes darted toward a companion, lying limp on the ground, then back to the calm face of the soldier holding him. Daniel let the silence stretch, the weight of it sinking deeper than any threat shouted in anger. He tightened his grip just enough to remind the man of his strength, then released him. The outlaw collapsed to his knees, coughing, clutching at his throat. Daniel bent, picked up the dropped crowbar, and held it casually in his hand. "Take him," he said, jerking his chin toward the unconscious figure. "And go. Tell the others this land isn't theirs to walk." The outlaw staggered, dragging his companion's arm over his shoulder, stumbling backward into the shadows. He glanced once more at Daniel, but the look he received was steady, cold, unflinching. Without another word, he vanished into the brush, the sound of his labored breathing fading into the night. Daniel stood alone in the yard, the crowbar still in his hand, the dirt marked with the scuffle. He dropped the tool beside the boards of the house, then crouched to check the ground. No damage, no alarm raised, no gun fired. The house still slept, the valley still quiet. He had ended it before it could begin. When he returned to the porch, Eleanor stirred faintly, her eyes opening just enough to see him. "Was it them?" she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. Daniel set the crowbar down by the door and touched her shoulder lightly. "Go back to sleep, Mom. It's handled." She nodded, her head sinking against the chair once more, her body finally trusting the promise of safety. Daniel remained awake, watching the horizon, his eyes unblinking. The first encounter had come and gone, and it had ended without noise, without blood. But he knew it was only a beginning. The outlaws had tested the ranch in silence. Soon they would return in force. The night had begun with confidence. Two men sent ahead, armed with crowbars and bravado, had been certain the widow's ranch would give them little trouble. By dawn, that confidence was gone. They moved through the brush like wounded animals, one half dragging the other, their steps uneven, their breathing ragged. Dust clung to their clothes. Sweat streaked their faces, and their eyes darted behind them as though the very shadows of Red Valley might give chase. They reached a clearing where the gang's makeshift camp sprawled, motorcycles lined in crooked rows, horses tied to posts, a fire pit burned down to embers. The men who lingered there stirred when they saw the pair stumble in, one barely conscious, the other coughing through a bruised throat. The laughter that usually marked the camp's mornings fell quiet, replaced by a ripple of unease. The leader rose from where he sat sharpening a knife, his sunglasses pushed up into his hair. He walked forward with deliberate slowness, the blade still in his hand. His eyes narrowed as he took in state of his men. The torn sleeves, the dirt smeared across their faces, the limp body dragged behind like a sack of grain. "What happened?" His voice was calm, but beneath it lay a coil of anger wound tight. The standing outlaw swallowed hard, clutching his throat where Daniel's arm had pressed the night before. His voice rasped hoarse. "He was there. Someone was waiting. We thought it was just the old woman." "It ain't." Murmurs spread to the camp, the others shifting uneasily. The leader crouched, gripping the chin of the half-conscious man to lift his face. A purple bruise spread across his temple, his eyes barely opening. The leader let him drop and turned back to the one still able to speak. "Who?" The outlaw wiped his mouth, spitting blood into the dirt. "Her son, big, moved like he knew what we'd do before we did it. Didn't fire a shot, just took us apart. Quiet, didn't even wake her." He shook his head, his fear plain. Said the land wasn't ours to walk. Told us to go back. The knife in the leader's hand stilled. His jaw worked as he weighed the words. Around them, the men muttered, trading uneasy glances. For weeks, the widow had been a figure of mockery. Frail, alone, a relic clinging to land too big for her. But the return of a son, a man who moved with soldiers' calm, shifted the weight of the story. Intimidation thrived on weakness. Resistance demanded a different kind of response. One of the horsemen spat into the dust. "So what?" He scared two men. "That don't make him a wall we can't break." But the silence that followed undercut his bravado. They all saw the state of the two before them. They had gone in with tools, expecting easy work. They had come back limping, broken, carrying more warning than excuse. The leader stood, sliding the knife into its sheath. His face was unreadable, but his voice carried sharp enough to cut the morning air. The widow's not alone anymore. That means this land won't fold as easy as we thought. He let his gaze sweep over the gathered men, catching each of them in turn. But don't mistake me. One man doesn't change what's coming. If he wants to stand in our way, he'll learn the same lesson she was about to. We don't back off. He turned to the outlaw still on his knees, his voice dropping lower, almost a growl. Next time you step foot there, you don't come back crawling. You come back with the ground in your hands, or not at all. The injured man nodded weakly, though his eyes betrayed no conviction. The warning Daniel had delivered was already carved deep into him. He had felt the choke of a soldier's arm, the silence of defeat delivered without noise or shot. He knew what the others did not yet admit, that they had crossed into something larger than they understood. The camp fell quiet, broken only by the crackle of the dying fire. The leader lit a cigarette, exhaling smoke that curled above the men like a banner. "We'll ride again," he said, his tone final. "And this time, we ride to break him too." The two who had returned lay near the fire, one groaning softly, the other staring into the dirt. Their bodies carried bruises, but their message carried further. The widow was not alone. The ranch no longer stood as easy prey, and in their silence, even the boldest of the gang understood that laughter would not come so easily the next time they faced a man waiting on the porch. By mid-morning, word had reached the town. No one knew exactly how the details had traveled, whether it was carried by a ranch hand who had ridden past in the early hours, or whispered from someone who had seen the outlaws limping back toward their camp. But by the time the shops opened, everyone knew the widow's son had returned, and two of the gang's men had been sent back broken for their trouble. At the diner, where farmers and mechanics gathered over coffee, voices lowered though no one wanted to be overheard. Some leaned closer across their mugs, a glimmer of satisfaction in their eyes. They had watched the outlaws roam too freely for too long, watched as the sheriff offered excuses instead of solutions. The idea that someone had finally stood them down, without a shot fired, without a fire set, stirred something that had gone quiet in them. They did not cheer loudly, but their nods to each other carried weight. Quiet approval settled among the town's corners like embers waiting for wind. But not all faces shared relief. At the hardware store, the owner shook his head as he rearranged nails on the shelf. "It'll only get worse now," he muttered to anyone who'd listen. "Those boys don't take embarrassment lightly. They'll come back, and next time, they'll make sure no one mistakes them for weak." His words carried the edge of fear, and others around him nodded. They had seen what escalation looked like. Broken windows in the night, barns burned to ground, cattle driven off until a family had nothing left. To some, Daniel's return felt less like deliverance and more like an invitation for ruin. By noon, the sheriff had heard the story 3 times over, each account carrying its own exaggerations. He sat at his desk with his hat tilted back, staring at the ceiling as the details rolled through his mind. 2 men sent to Widow's Ranch, 2 men crawling back with bruises and shame, a son standing in their way, quiet as a wall. The sheriff rubbed his jaw, the stubble scratching his palm. He knew what it meant. The fragile balance he had been holding, avoiding confrontation with the outlaws while keeping the town calm, was slipping. He leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, and studied the badge that lay on the wood. Once, it had meant something in Red Valley. Now it felt more like a token of a role he was struggling to fill. If Daniel Briggs had returned with military calm and steel in his gaze, the sheriff's authority would shrink further. People would start looking to the soldier instead of the lawman. That thought stung more than he wanted to admit. Outside on the boardwalk, townsfolk gathered in small knots, their conversations low but intense. Some spoke of Daniel with respect, recalling his service, his years away. Others worried aloud, pointing out that a war fought in distant places was not the same as facing men who lived just beyond the ridge and knew every trail. Yet even the fearful could not deny the shift. The widow was no longer alone, and that fact had unsettled both the outlaws and the town that had watched helplessly for months. At the church steps, an old rancher leaned against the rail, speaking in a voice that carried farther than he intended. Maybe it's about time someone showed them boys they ain't kings of this valley. His words drew nods from a handful of men nearby, men who had once stood straighter before the outlaw's shadow grew too heavy. Hope was fragile here, but it flickered. Back at his office, the sheriff pushed away from the desk and walked to the window. He watched the street, saw the way people leaned close, the way their eyes no longer darted away from the subject of the gang, but lingered on it with a kind of wary resolve. He exhaled through his nose, slow and heavy. His authority had been eroding with every unchecked act of intimidation. Now, with Daniel Briggs home, it was collapsing altogether. He felt it like a weight pressing on his chest. The law was supposed to bring order, but in Red Valley, order had come from fear of the gang. If Daniel shifted that balance, the sheriff's badge would be little more than a piece of tin. By evening, the talk had settled into the fabric of the town. Some held their heads higher as they locked their doors, whispering that maybe the tide had turned. Others double-checked the shutters and prayed that the gang would not drag the rest of them into their fight. The air carried both relief and dread, woven tight together. And beyond the ridge, where the outlaws nursed their bruises and seethed at their humiliation, the silence thickened. Everyone knew it could not last. The widow's ranch was no longer a story of one woman's stubborn stand. It was a story of her son's return, and that story would shape what came next, for the town, for the gang, and for the sheriff whose grip on Red Valley slipped a little further with each passing day. The sky was painted in the deep amber of dusk when the first sound carried across the valley. It began low, a faint growl of engines that rose and blended with the rhythm of hooves. Daniel stood at the porch rail, his eyes narrowing as the horizon darkened with dust. Eleanor sat behind him in her chair, the rifle across her knees, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. She had known this moment would come, though the weight of it pressed heavier now that the air trembled with the approach of many. The outlaws did not creep this time. They came loud, brazen, a swarm of motorcycles and horses, surging down the road with headlights cutting through the fading light. Shouts rose above the roar of engines, laughter laced with menace, the sound of men eager to reclaim the pride they had lost. They rode straight through the open gate, spreading wide into the yard like wolves circling prey. The barn doors, already scarred, shook under the vibration of their arrival. Dust choked the air, clinging to the boards of the house and to the breath in Eleanor's chest. Daniel stepped down from the porch, his stance calm but deliberate. He held no rifle, no pistol, just a quiet certainty in his movements. The traps he had set earlier now waited in silence. Lines strung low between posts, alarms ready to rattle. He let the gang ride closer, their bravado thick, before shifting his weight and raising his hand. A sharp tug on a hidden rope sent one of the trip lines taut. The first motorcycle slammed into it. The rider flung into the dirt with a cry that cut the laughter short. The crash sent the others swerving, curses echoing through the dust. The horses shied at the sudden noise, one rearing high, nearly throwing its rider. Daniel moved fast, cutting across the yard with the efficiency of a man who had lived through ambushes before. He grabbed the dismounted outlaw, pressing him to the ground with a knee to his chest, disarming him before tossing the weapon aside. He did not linger. Another man rushed, swinging a crowbar, but Daniel ducked low, striking with the butt of his knife to drop him into the dirt. From the porch, Eleanor lifted the rifle. Her hands trembled, but her eye was steady as she fired into the air. The sharp crack of the shot cut through the chaos, startling the gang into brief stillness. "You won't have this land," she shouted, her voice carrying louder than her age should allow. "Not while I draw breath." The riders cursed, but hesitation rippled through them. They had expected an old woman to crumble, not to raise a rifle at dusk with her son cutting through their ranks like a blade. Another engine revved. Another horse pawed the ground, but the bravado had fractured. One of them spurred forward, only to find his path blocked by another line strung tight across the yard. His front wheel caught, his body tumbling into the dust as his comrades shouted in confusion. Daniel moved again, swift and silent. He disarmed another, twisting the weapon from his grasp, sending the man sprawling. Each movement was calculated, precise, the training of years meeting the soil of home. He did not kill, but he made clear with every strike that this was ground they would not take. Eleanor fired again, this time close enough to send splinters flying from a fence post near the riders. The message was sharp. This was no longer their playground. The gang's leader barked commands, but his voice carried strain. He had seen his men fall, seen their charge stumble. His sunglasses slipped as he snarled into the dusk. "Fall back," he shouted. "Fall back, we'll come again." Engines roared to life, horses wheeled, and the outlaws pulled away, dragging their injured, leaving the yard scattered with tools, weapons, and the marks of their failed ambush. Dust rose behind them as they retreated, their shouts fading into the night. Daniel stood in the yard, chest heaving with control breath, eyes still sharp on the horizon. Eleanor lowered the rifle, her hands shaking now that the noise had gone, the weight of her stand pressing hard against her body. He walked back to the porch, placing his hand on her shoulder, steadying her. "They'll return," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Daniel replied, his voice calm, certain, "and we'll be ready." The valley quieted once more, the last light of day sinking into the earth. The ranch still stood, scarred but unbroken, defended not by walls but by a mother or son, their resolve bound tighter than any rope. The valley air was heavy with dust when the gang returned, engines snarling low, horses restless under the fading sun. They came slower this time, not in the reckless wave of noise that had marked their earlier rides, but in a tighter formation, their movements sharpened by frustration. The failed ambush still weighed on them, bruises carried as reminders that the widow's land was no longer unguarded. At the head of the group rode their leader, his sunglasses pushed high into his hair, jaw tight, the set of his shoulders promising violence. Daniel stood in the yard waiting, his boots planted firm in the dirt, arms loose at his sides. He carried no weapon in his hands, though the knife at his belt and the rifle propped on the porch were close enough. He did not need to hold them to make his point. His presence alone had steadied the house, and the men riding toward him felt the shift even if they would not admit it. Behind him, Eleanor sat on her chair, shawl draped across her shoulders, rifle resting across her lap. She said nothing, her silence as firm as her son's stance. The motorcycle slowed first, engines idling, the riders leaning slightly as they formed a semicircle in the yard. The horses came to a stop behind them, the animals snorting and stamping the earth. The leader dismounted, his boots grinding into the dust as he walked forward, stopping only a few feet from Daniel. The men behind him muttered, their laughter absent now, their bravado dulled by the memory of ropes, traps, and silence in the night. The leader spat into the dirt and lifted his chin. "You should have stayed gone," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the porch. "This valley didn't need you coming back to stir things up. Your mother was ready to bend. Now you've made this worse for her." Daniel's eyes didn't leave his. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, level without the heat of anger. "You've chosen the wrong house." The words hung there, heavier than a shout, settling into the ears of every man present. A ripple of unease stirred in the group. Some shifted in their seats, glancing at each other, measuring whether their leader's threats still carried weight. The silence stretched long enough for the creak of Eleanor's rocking chair to fill it. The leader smirked, though it was thinner than before. "You think one man changes what's coming? We've run this valley for years. No badge in town will stop us. No soldier's son will either." Daniel took a single step forward, closing the space between them. His gaze was steady, his words deliberate. "I don't need to stop you everywhere. Just here, just now. This land isn't yours to claim. It isn't yours to mark, to steal, or to burn. You've mistaken silence for weakness. That's over." The men on horseback shifted uneasily, their animals restless, as if feeling the tension coil tighter. The riders on motorcycles gripped their handlebars, waiting for the word to lunge. But no one moved. They had expected Daniel to shout, to bluster, to wave his rifle. Instead, he spoke with the certainty of a man who had already measured the ground, who knew where every trap was laid, who understood the rhythm of battle in ways they did not. The leader sneered, tried to mask his hesitation. "You're outnumbered. You and your old mother can't hold forever. One night, One mistake, and you'll both be gone. Daniel shook his head once, slow and sure. Numbers don't win if they're led blind. You've already lost men here. You've already lost face. Keep pushing and you'll lose more than that. For the first time, the leader's smirk faltered, his jaw clenching at the truth pressed against him. He turned his head slightly, scanning his men, and saw the doubt in their eyes. They had followed him through barns burned and cattle stolen. But standing in front of Daniel Briggs, they saw something different. They saw a man who didn't bluff, who didn't rattle, who had already made it clear without gunfire that he could break them one by one. Silence held the yard for a long moment. Dust swirled between them, the sun lowering behind the ridge, painting the horizon in blood-red streaks. Finally, the leader stepped back, his boots grinding harder into the dirt than before. "We'll see," he muttered, though the words lacked the force of command. He turned sharply, walking back toward his bike. The engines roared again, the horses stamped, and the gang wheeled around in a storm of dust and noise. They left as they had arrived, but the laughter that usually followed them was absent. Only the sound of engines echoed down the road until the valley swallowed it. Daniel remained standing where he was, his chest rising steady, his eyes fixed on the horizon long after they disappeared. Behind him, Eleanor's voice broke the quiet, thin but firm. "You sounded just like your father." Daniel turned, his expression softening. He walked back to the porch, picked up the rifle, and leaned it against her chair. "I sounded like your son," he said. The valley fell quiet again, the silence no longer heavy with fear, but with a certainty that words had carried their own weight tonight. Words before blows, and a warning none of the outlaws would soon forget. The night fell without ceremony. The valley bathed in a quiet too perfect to trust. Daniel sat on the porch steps, his back straight, his hands resting lightly on his knees. His eyes tracked the horizon, where a faint glow of dust had begun to rise long before the sound carried. He knew what it meant. The gang was done with warnings, done with games. Tonight, they would test the ranch with everything they had. Behind him, the old screen door creaked as Eleanor stepped out, her shawl around her shoulders, the rifle in her hands. She lowered herself into her chair without a word, her eyes steady, her jaw set. The noise came like thunder rolling down the ridge. Engines roared in chorus, headlights cutting through the dark in long white beams. Horses galloped alongside, their riders leaning forward, rifles glinting in the moonlight. Dust rose like smoke, cloaking their charge as they swept toward the ranch in a storm of sound. This was no small raid. It was an attempt to overwhelm, to break the house and its defenders in one furious rush. Daniel stood as the first motorcycles burst through the gate, their tires spitting gravel. He moved with the calm precision of a man who had seen chaos many times before. His traps waited in silence, triggered now by the reckless speed of the riders. One engine choked as a line snapped taut across its path, the bike flipping end over end, its rider sprawling into the dirt. Another slammed into a barricade he had reinforced near the corral, the machine crumpling as its rider was thrown clear. Shouts of anger cut through the air, their confidence cracking. The horses followed, their riders firing shots into the air, the cracks echoing across the yard. Daniel ducked low, moving with deliberate speed. He seized one rider as he passed too close, yanking him from the saddle and driving him hard into the ground. The man's rifle skittered away as Daniel pinned him with a knee, delivering a quick blow that left him motionless. Another outlaw swung a bat, rushing from the side, but Daniel pivoted, catching the swing with his forearm, twisting until it would snap under pressure. His counterstrike was swift, sending the attacker sprawling into the dust. From the porch, Eleanor raised her rifle, her hands trembling but her aim steady. She did not fire wildly. She waited, breathing through the chaos, until one rider pressed too close, his headlights sweeping across her porch. She pulled the trigger once. The shot split the night, the bullet striking the fence post inches from the man's leg. With splintered dirt sprayed, and the rider jerked his reins, his horse screaming as it veered away. The sound of her shot carried across the yard, louder in its meaning than in its noise. It was not a kill, but it was a line drawn in fire. The gang faltered. Their laughter had been replaced by curses, their rhythm broken by traps, by Daniel's hands, by the widow's steady aim. They circled again, slower now, their bravado unraveling. Daniel moved through them like a shadow, disarming, striking, never wasting a motion. He seized another rider by the jacket, yanking him from his bike, the machine crashing into the side of the barn. He turned, eyes sharp, his breath controlled, scanning for the next. Each time they surged, they found themselves checked, by a line, by a strike, by the crack of Eleanor's rifle echoing through the night. The leader shouted from the rear, trying to rally them, but the noise carried strain. His men were scattered, some crawling back to their feet, others retreating toward the gate. Dust clung to their faces, sweat shining in the moonlight. Their bravado shattered against the walls of a house they had thought too weak to defend itself. When the engines finally began to pull away, when the horses wheeled in the dust and the men shouted for retreat, Daniel stood in the center of the yard, chest heaving but eyes calm. He had not fired a bullet, but the ground was littered with their failure. Eleanor lowered the rifle, her arms heavy, but her face steady. The porch still stood, the house still unbroken, the ranch still theirs. The silence that followed was sharp, filled with the smell of burned fuel and churned earth. Eleanor leaned back into her chair, the weight of her years pressing hard against her shoulders, but the fire in her eyes unshaken. Daniel walked back to her, his shadow long in the moonlight. She looked up at him and allowed herself the faintest smile, warm but certain. "They thought we'd break," she said. Daniel shook his head, scanning the dark horizon where the outlaws had vanished. They learned different. And in the stillness of the valley, where dust still hung in the air and the boards of the porch still trembled faintly, mother and son sat together, unbroken, holding the line as the night settled over them once more. The dust of battle still hung low in the valley when the first glint of headlights appeared on the road from town. Eleanor sat on the porch, the rifle resting against her knees, her shawl pulled tight against the night air. Her breathing was steady now, though her body carried the weight of exhaustion. Daniel stood near the gate, his hands resting on his hips, his frame broad in the glow of a lantern he had hung from the fence post. At his feet lay the gang's leader, bound at the wrists, his head bowed, the fight long gone from him. Along the fence, others sat slumped, their hands tied, their bravado broken. Each one a shadow of the menace they had been hours before. The roar of the sheriff's cruiser broke the quiet, followed by the crunch of tires as it pulled into the yard. Another vehicle followed, then another, 3 in total, their lights sweeping across the battered barn doors and the scattered signs of the fight. Dust swirled in their beams, catching on the spent casings, the broken boards, the scuffed earth. Doors slammed and men stepped out, hats low, pistols at their sides, expecting chaos still alive. Instead, they found order carved from violence. The sheriff himself walked forward, his boots crunching in the gravel, his hat pulled low. His eyes swept the yard, taking the side of the gang, beaten but alive, tied to posts like cattle awaiting judgment. His mouth tightened, not in anger but in the weight of realization. The law had arrived too late, and the work had already been done by another man. "What in God's name happened here?" he muttered, though the words carried more awe than demand. Daniel met his gaze without flinching. His voice was calm, level, carrying no pride but no apology. "They came to take what wasn't theirs. They won't be riding back tonight." The sheriff glanced at Eleanor, still seated on her chair, her rifle angled across her lap. Her eyes met his, tired but unbroken. For months she had called on his office, received promises and hesitation, words with no weight behind them. Now she sat in victory of a kind he had not provided, her son standing as a line the law had refused to draw. Deputies moved among the prisoners, checking bindings, collecting weapons scattered in the dirt. They found knives, crowbars, pistols left behind in haste. Each outlaw remained silent, their eyes lowered, their arrogance stripped away. The leader lifted his head once, his swollen lip curled faintly, but the glance he gave Daniel carried no threats, only recognition. He had been measured, and he had fallen short. The sheriff removed his hat, ran a hand through his hair, and exhaled slow. He had expected to preside over wreckage, perhaps even loss. Instead, he stood at the edge of a yard held not by his badge, but by a man who had returned from war to defend his own blood. Around him, the deputies exchanged glances, their own unease plain. They knew the truth as well as he did. The sheriff's authority had withered, and tonight it had been replaced. Eleanor spoke, her voice thin but clear. "You took your time." The sheriff turned to her, shame flickering across his features. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There were no excuses left that would not crumble under the weight of her stare. He settled for a nod, tipping his hat slightly in respect, though the gesture felt too small. Daniel stepped closer to his mother, his presence shielding her as much as answering for her. "Take them," he said, motioning toward the captured gang. "See to it they don't walk back into this valley again." The sheriff hesitated, as though the order came from a man who wore no badge but carried authority all the same. Then he gave a curt nod, signaling to his deputies. One by one, the outlaws were hauled to their feet, their chains rattling as they were marched toward the waiting cruisers. The night filled with the sound of boots and clinking iron, the ranch yard echoing with a new rhythm, not of intimidation, but of justice being forced into motion. As the vehicles pulled away, their red taillights glowing in the dust, silence returned. The sheriff lingered for a moment, his hat in his hands. He looked at Eleanor, then at Daniel, his voice low. "You've changed things here. Folks will know it." Daniel gave no answer. He simply turned back toward the porch, where his mother waited. The sheriff watched him a moment longer, then walked back to his cruiser, the weight of his role heavier than it had ever been. When the last car disappeared down the road, the valley was quiet again. The chains rattled faintly in the dirt where the gang had been tied, the only evidence of what had passed. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for the first time in peace. Daniel stood over her, scanning the horizon still, a sentinel against whatever might come next. The first light of morning stretched long and soft across Red Valley, spilling over the ridges and settling on the quiet ranch. The dust of the night before it settled, leaving the yard scarred with tracks, broken boards, and the faint outlines of struggle, but the house still stood. The barn doors bore their wounds. The fence lines sagged where they had been cut, yet the land itself breathed steady, unchanged in its essence. The fields caught the sun and shimmered faintly, as though reminding those who walked here that it had seen storms before and endured them all. Inside the kitchen, the smell of coffee filled the air. Eleanor moved slowly, her cane tapping against the worn boards, the shawl draped loose over her shoulders. She set a plate of biscuits on the table, the same wooden table that had held decades of meals, laughter, and silence in equal measure. Her hand shook faintly as she arranged the food, but her movements carried purpose. This morning was different. It was not a morning lived in fear of glass shattering or engines roaring. It was one lived in the wake of survival. Daniel entered from outside, his boots leaving faint dust on the threshold. His shirt was damp with sweat, his hair tousled from the early work of checking the fence lines again, gathering tools scattered in the yard. He paused in the doorway, his eyes sweeping the kitchen the way they swept a battlefield, taking in every detail, every change. When his gaze landed on the table, on the food his mother had prepared, something in his expression softened. "Sit," Eleanor said, her voice still carrying the firmness of command despite her years. "You've walked enough ground for one morning." Daniel obeyed, lowering himself into the chair across from her. The table creaked under his weight, the same sound it had made when he was a boy, sweaty from chores and eager for bread. She poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs, sliding one toward him. He wrapped his hand around it, the warmth seeping into calloused skin. For a long moment, they said nothing, the silence not heavy but whole, filled with everything that did not need to be spoken. Eleanor broke it first, her voice low. "I thought they'd take it from me, piece by piece. The cattle, the barn, the nights, all of it. I thought I'd be the last to see this house stand." Daniel's eyes held hers, steady clear. "They won't take it, not while I'm here." Her lips trembled into something close to a smile. She looked down at the table, tracing a groove in the wood with one thin finger. "Your father built this table with his own hands. Every meal we've ever had sat here. Even when you were a boy, when you thought I wasn't watching, you'd run your hand across it the same way you do now. This table has outlasted him, outlasted me in ways, outlasted storms and winters and debts. And now it's outlasted them. Daniel leaned back slightly, sipping his coffee. The morning sun spilled through the window, catching his profile, making him look younger for a brief second. The land remembers, Mom. So do we. They ate in quiet, the biscuits dry but filling, the coffee strong and grounding. Eleanor's hand shook only once, and Daniel steadied the plate without a word. She let him, no longer ashamed of the weakness that had once felt like surrender. The strength that sat across from her now was hers as much as his, forged in the years she had held on alone, waiting for the day he would keep his promise and come home. Outside, the valley stretched wide, the scars of the night plain to see, but already folding into the earth's long memory. The broken fences would be mended, the barn doors could be repaired. What mattered most had endured, the house, the land, and the bond that tied mother and son to both. As the sun rose higher, Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her eyes closing briefly, the warmth on her face. For the first time in many months, she felt not like a widow holding ground against the inevitable, but like a keeper of something that had proven stronger than those who tried to claim it. She opened her eyes again, looking at Daniel. "You'll see it through," she said. "When I'm gone, you'll see it through." Daniel nodded, his voice firm but quiet. "I will." The house creaked as it always had. The clock ticked above the mantel. The coffee cooled in their mugs. The valley outside gleamed under the light of morning, not unmarked, not untouched, but alive. The ranch, like the woman who had guarded it through long nights and threats, had survived. And at the old wooden table, in the calm after the storm, mother and son shared their meal, the silence between them no longer burdened by fear, but filled with the steady rhythm of endurance.